In the winter of 1916, a murdered man lay beneath the frozen Neva River, his lungs filled with water, proof he had survived poison, bullets, and beating, only to drown beneath the ice. Before his death, he penned a prophecy. If nobles spilled his blood, the Tsar and all his family would perish within 2 years, and Russia herself would drown in blood. 18 months later, in a basement in Ekaterinburg, that prophecy was fulfilled with terrible precision. This is the story of Grigori Rasputin, the mad monk who could not be killed, whose death curse brought down 3 centuries of Romanov rule, and whose shadow still whispers across the graves of empire. Welcome, dear listener, to the Bedside Historian, where the shadows of the past come alive in the quiet hours of night. Here, we do not sanitize history or dress it in the comfortable clothes of modern understanding. No, we return to those dark and desperate times as they truly were, told in the voices and visions of those who lived them. Tonight we journey to Imperial Russia in its final blood-soaked years, where a peasant mystic held the fate of millions in his unwashed hands, and where superstition and power danced a macabre waltz toward revolution and ruin. Settle into your pillows, dear listener. Let the lamp burn low, and follow us now into the frost and darkness of a dying empire, where one man's strange gift became a nation's curse. Chapter 1. The Frost Before the Storm. The winter of 1916 descended upon Petersburg like executioner's hood, silent, suffocating, inevitable. In the fashionable districts along the Nevsky Prospect, where gas lamps cast their trembling light upon snow-covered boulevards, the city maintained its facade of imperial grandeur. The Alexander Column still pierced the grey sky above Palace Square. The golden spire of the Peter and Paul fortress still gleamed when rare sunlight broke through the perpetual clouds. The great grey facades of ministry buildings still projected the power of autocracy, that ancient system whereby one man's word was law for 130 million souls. Yet beneath this surface of order and tradition, the Russian Empire was dying. One felt it in the bread queues that stretched longer each morning, lines of shawled women and hollow-eyed children waiting in the bitter cold for loaves that grew smaller and more expensive with each passing week. One heard it in the whispered conversations in the taverns of the workers' quarters, where men spoke in low voices of strikes and revolution, their words half hope and half terror. One saw it in the trains arriving daily at the Warsaw station, disgorging their cargo of wounded soldiers, men with empty sleeves and bandaged faces, men who had marched singing toward the German guns and returned as broken testament to military catastrophe. The Great War, as men had begun to call this conflict that set the world aflame, had entered its 3rd year. 3 years of slaughter on an industrial scale that previous generations could not have imagined. 3 years of Russia throwing her peasant soldiers against German machine guns and artillery, watching whole armies dissolve in blood and mud along the Eastern Front. 3 years of defeats masked by official communiques, of villages emptied of men, of factories straining to produce shells and rifles while the people starved. In the working-class districts beyond the elegant centre, darkness took on physical form. Buildings leaned together like conspirators along unpaved streets thick with frozen mud and refuse. Here, whole families crowded into single rooms, their breath visible in the unheated air, burning furniture for warmth when coal could not be found. Here, the revolutionary pamphlets circulated from hand to hand, speaking of workers' councils and the overthrow of Tsarist oppression. Here, the police spies, the Okhrana's vast network of informers, moved through crowds like wolves among sheep, noting faces, compiling lists, occasionally dragging some unfortunate soul away to the Kresty prison or the Peter and Paul fortress, from which few returned unchanged. The capital itself had recently undergone a transformation of name, though not of character. What had been St. Petersburg at the war's outbreak, that Germanic name bestowed by Peter the Great 2 centuries prior, was now Petrograd, a more properly Slavic designation meant to purge Teutonic influence from Russian soil, as if changing a city's name could alter its fate, as if words could stop the rot spreading through the empire's foundations. Among the aristocracy, in those grand palaces and townhouses where chandeliers still blazed with electric light and servants still stood in perfect livery, a different sort of darkness gathered. At elegant dinner parties and diplomatic receptions, the conversation would begin pleasantly enough. Discussion of the latest ballet at the Mariinsky, the scandal of some society divorce, the prospects for next season's social calendar. But inevitably, often after the ladies had withdrawn and the men had settled with their brandy and cigars, the talk would turn to politics. And when it turned to politics, one name emerged again and again, spoken sometimes in anger, sometimes in disgust, sometimes in a hushed fear that seemed absurd among such powerful and educated men. Rasputin. The name carried the sound of something unclean, something that should not exist in civilized company. Yet, exist he did, and more than that, he thrived. He walked the corridors of power with impunity. He gave audiences in his shabby apartment like a Tsar granting petitions. He interfered in military appointments, in the selection of ministers, in decisions of war and peace, and he did so not through any official position, not through birth or education or demonstrated competence, but through a hold upon the imperial family that defied rational explanation. How had it come to this? How had an empire that had defeated Napoleon, that had expanded across 2 continents, that maintained the largest standing army in Europe, how had such an empire fallen under the influence of an illiterate peasant from Siberia, who could neither read nor write, who dressed in filthy peasant blouses and reeked of cheap wine, who was whispered to practice dark rituals and debauchery that would shame a common criminal? The answer, like so many answers in Russia's long and blood-soaked history, lay in the intersection of power and desperation, of ancient superstition and modern crisis, of a mother's love and a nation's decay. To understand Rasputin's rise, one must first understand the throne he came to dominate. The Winter Palace, that vast Baroque monument to imperial power, housed a family carrying a secret that would have been unthinkable a century prior. In an age when royal marriages were arranged between the great houses of Europe, when the same blood flowed through related dynasties across the continent, a curse had spread through royal veins, a disease called hemophilia. The bleeding disease passed silently through the female line to afflict male heirs with a condition that turned the simple act of living into a potentially fatal venture. The Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, only son and heir of Tsar Nicholas III, carried this cursed blood. A bump that would leave a common child with a mere bruise could trigger internal bleeding in Alexei that would last for weeks, causing the boy to scream in agony as blood pooled in his joints, as his small body swelled with hemorrhage, as his parents watched helplessly and the finest physicians in Europe administered their useless treatments and spoke in grave tones about nothing they could do. For the Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna, every day became an exercise in terror. The woman who ruled as Empress of all Russia, German-born, converted to Orthodoxy, never fully accepted by the Russian people who saw her as foreign, lived in constant fear that her son would die from some accident too minor to prevent. She wrapped him in protective isolation. She consulted doctors, specialists, holy men, anyone who might offer hope. The medical establishment, with all its modern knowledge and prestigious credentials, could offer her nothing but sympathy and statistical probabilities of her son reaching adulthood. Into this void of hope walked Grigori Rasputin. The details of his first summons to the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, that royal retreat 15 miles south of the capital, remained shrouded in the murk of court intrigue and selective memory. Some said he was recommended by the Grand Duchesses Militsa and Anastasia, Montenegrine princesses who had married into the Romanov family and who maintained a salon of mystics and spiritual seekers. Others claimed various society ladies brought him to the Tsarina's attention, women who had consulted the Siberian holy man for their own ailments and been impressed by his apparent powers. What matters is not the specific chain of introduction, but what happened when Rasputin first stood before the suffering child in 1905 during one of Alexei's bleeding episodes. The peasant mystic, with his wild hair and unwashed beard, his rough Siberian dialect and penetrating grey-blue eyes, knelt beside the bed of the heir to the Russian throne. He placed his hands upon the boy. He spoke prayers in his peasant's voice, mixing orthodox formulations with his own cryptic additions. He gazed at the child with those strange eyes that so many described as hypnotic, compelling, windows into something not entirely human, and the bleeding stopped, whether through hypnotic suggestion that calmed the boy and his mother, thereby reducing stress that may have exacerbated the condition, whether through some genuine mystical healing power that science cannot measure, whether through simple coincidence of timing. None of these explanations mattered to Alexandra. Her son, her precious only son, the heir upon whom the dynasty's future rested, had been saved by this strange holy man when all the learned doctors had failed. From that moment, Grigori Rasputin owned a piece of the Tsarina's soul. The court, observing this development, felt the first tremors of unease. Russia had a long tradition of holy wanderers, of straniki who walked the countryside offering blessings and prophecies. Russia had always maintained a mystical undercurrent beneath its Orthodox Christianity, a folk religion of icons and relics and miraculous interventions. But never before had such a figure gained such access to the throne itself. Never before had emperors and empresses knelt before a peasant and called him father in the spiritual sense, seeking his counsel not merely on matters of faith, but on affairs of state. The more traditional nobility watched in growing horror as Rasputin became a regular presence at Tsarskoye Selo. He would arrive unannounced, walking through corridors where ministers and generals waited for audiences that might never come. He spoke to the Tsar and Tsarina with a familiarity that defied every protocol of court etiquette. He used the familiar thou form when addressing them, that intimate form of address used between family members or very close friends, which no subject should ever use toward the sovereign. More disturbing still were the rumours of his behaviour outside the palace. Stories circulated through Petersburg's society of Rasputin's nightly activities, drinking to excess in taverns, propositioning women with crude directness, boasting of his influence over the imperial family while deep in his cups. The Okhrana, the secret police tasked with protecting the throne, compiled thick files of surveillance reports documenting the holy man's movements through the capital's underworld of bathhouses and restaurants, of the women who visited his apartment at all hours, of statements he made that bordered on treason in their casual revelation of state secrets. Yet when concerned officials brought these reports to the Tsarina's attention, she dismissed them as lies fabricated by enemies of the throne. When members of the extended Romanov family expressed their alarm at Rasputin's growing influence, Alexandra saw only conspiracy and jealousy. She had witnessed with her own eyes the miracle of her son's healing. She had felt in her bones the spiritual connection between this simple man of God and divine providence. All criticism of our friend, as she and Nicholas referred to Rasputin in their private correspondence, was therefore criticism of God's chosen instrument, and thus blasphemy itself. By 1916, as that terrible winter descended upon the dying capital, Rasputin had become more than a court favourite or spiritual advisor. He had become a symbol of everything rotting within the imperial system. To the liberals in the Duma, Russia's weak parliament, he represented the triumph of medieval superstition over modern governance. To the military command, he represented interference in strategic decisions by someone with no understanding of warfare. To the common people, increasingly desperate and angry, he represented the corruption and incompetence of a regime that could send millions to die in futile battles while a drunken peasant whispered in the ears of power. The empire was dying, and everyone knew it. The only question was whether it would collapse gradually, through reform and evolution, or violently through revolution and blood. And somehow, impossibly, the fate of millions seemed to rest upon the shoulders of one strange mystic from the Siberian wastes, a man who had arrived in the capital a decade earlier as a wandering pilgrim, and who now held the imperial family in a grip that appeared unbreakable. In the grand salons and the workers' taverns, in the corridors of the Winter Palace and the cells of the revolutionary underground, in the trenches along the German front and the bread queues of the capital's slums, men and women asked the same question. How much longer could this endure? How much longer before something broke? How much longer before the accumulated weight of catastrophe, corruption, and mystical madness brought the entire edifice of autocracy crashing down? The frost deepened, the bread queues lengthened, the casualty lists grew. And in his shabby apartment on Gorokovia Street, Grigori Rasputin received his petitioners and spoke his prophecies, and lived his strange double life as both holy man and debaucher, as both the empire's saviour and its doom. The storm was coming. Everyone could feel it. But few could imagine its true fury, or how completely it would sweep away not merely Rasputin and the Romanovs, but the entire world they represented. 3 centuries of dynasty, tradition, and absolute power, dissolving into revolution, civil war, and a new and terrible order that would remake Russia in blood and iron. For now, though, in that winter of 1916, the old world still stood. The Tsar still wore his crown. The Tsarina still believed in miracles, and Rasputin still walked the corridors of power, his strange eyes seeing what others could not, his rough hands holding threads of fate that stretched from a peasant's hut in Siberia to the throne of the largest empire on earth. This is where our tale truly begins, not with Rasputin's birth or early life, which we shall explore, but with the recognition that by 1916, all the pieces were in place for catastrophe. The empire was broken, the dynasty was cursed, the people were desperate, and the mad monk stood at the centre of it all, the living embodiment of how power and superstition, desperation and faith could combine to produce a force that would shake the foundations of the world. Chapter 2, From Pokrovskoy's Mud to Holy Wanderer. The village of Pokrovskoye crouched on the banks of the Tura River in the Tobolsk province of Siberia, some 1,300 miles east of Moscow, in a land where winter lasted 8 months and summer arrived like a brief, desperate gasp before the cold returned. This was not the romantic wilderness of adventure tales, but a harsh country of scattered settlements where peasants scratched subsistence from poor soil and long nights bred either madness or mysticism, and sometimes both in equal measure. Into this world on January 21st, 1869, by the old Julian calendar that Russia still followed, was born Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin. His surname derived from the Russian word Rasputny, meaning debauched or licentious, though whether this reflected the character of his family line or was acquired later through personal reputation remains a matter of historical dispute. What is certain is that nothing in his birth suggested destiny beyond the ordinary misery of Siberian peasant life. His father, Yefim, worked as a coachman and farmer, neither wealthy nor destitute by the standards of that place and time. His mother, Anna, bore several children, though in the manner common to that era of high infant mortality, young Grigori lost siblings to disease and accident. The family lived in a crude timber dwelling, sharing their space with livestock during the brutal winters, sleeping on stoves for warmth, subsisting on black bread and cabbage, and whatever fish could be pulled from the river. The boy Grigori showed little early promise of his extraordinary future. Village records and later recollections paint him as wild and unruly, quick-tempered, given to brawling with other boys, demonstrating neither particular intelligence nor religious inclination. He never learned to read or write beyond perhaps scratching his name, and would remain functionally illiterate throughout his life. In a land where formal education barely existed outside the towns, this was not unusual. What was unusual were the stories that began to accumulate around him, even in youth. Some villagers remembered him claiming visions and dreams that later proved prophetic. When a horse was stolen from a local farmer, the young Grigori supposedly identified the thief through some inner sight, though whether this was genuine perception or clever deduction based on local gossip was never clear. Other tales spoke of an incident where he nearly drowned in the Tura River, an experience that some later claimed changed him, as if he had touched the boundary between life and death and returned carrying something from that liminal space. What is documented beyond folklore is that as a young man, Rasputin established a reputation for drinking and debauchery that would have seemed unremarkable in that hard-drinking frontier society, except that it coexisted with growing religious fervour. He married a local peasant woman, Praskovia Fyodorovna Dubrovina, in 1887, when he was 18. She bore him several children and would remain his wife throughout his life, enduring his long absences and scandalous behaviour with the stoic resignation common to peasant women of that era. But marriage and fatherhood did not domesticate Grigori Rasputin. Instead, sometime in his late 20s, accounts vary on the precise timing and catalyst, he underwent a transformation that would set him on the path toward his strange destiny. The story he later told, embellished with each retelling, spoke of a vision of the Virgin Mary that came to him while working in his father's fields. In this vision, the Mother of God commanded him to abandon his dissolute life and seek salvation through pilgrimage and prayer. Whether this was genuine mystical experience, psychological crisis, or calculated reinvention, it marked a turning point. Rasputin became a strannik, a wanderer, a pilgrim, one of those rootless holy men who travelled the vast distances of Russia seeking spiritual enlightenment. The institution of the stranniki was deeply embedded in Russian religious culture. These wanderers rejected settled life and worldly attachments, travelling from monastery to monastery, shrine to shrine, living on charity and the hospitality of believers. They were simultaneously respected as holy fools who had surrendered everything for God and suspected as potential frauds or even heretics. The line between authentic spiritual seeker and cunning charlatan was always blurred among the Straniki, and many walk that line with deliberate ambiguity. Rasputin walked farther than most. Over the course of several years in the 1890s, he journeyed thousands of miles, mostly on foot. He visited the great monasteries of European Russia. He made pilgrimage to Mount Athos in Greece, that ancient centre of Orthodox monasticism, where monks had lived in prayer for 1,000 years. He travelled to Jerusalem, walking across continents to touch the stones where Christ had walked, following routes used by pilgrims for centuries. These journeys were not undertaken in comfort. He walked in crude boots that fell apart and were replaced with whatever he could beg or barter. He slept in fields and forests, in monastery guest houses, in the barns of charitable peasants. He fasted until weakness made the world shimmer with visions. He prayed until words lost meaning and became pure sound. The privation and isolation of such wandering could break a man's mind, or forge it into something harder and stranger than normal human consciousness. When Rasputin returned to Pokrovskoye after years of wandering, he was transformed. The wild youth who had been known for drinking and brawling now spoke in religious riddles and claimed mystical insights. He had developed the penetrating gaze that would become his most remarked upon feature, those grey-blue eyes that seemed to bore into one's soul, that held one's attention with almost physical force. He dressed in the rough clothing of a peasant holy man, long tunic, wide belt, crude boots, and let his hair and beard grow wild. More importantly, he had developed a reputation. Stories of his pilgrimages spread through the region. He began to attract followers, particularly women, who came to him for spiritual counsel and healing. He claimed the ability to see into hearts, to know sins unconfessed, to offer remedies for ailments both physical and spiritual. Whether through hypnotic technique, psychological insight, or genuine mystical power, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to influence those who came under his gaze. His methods were unorthodox, even by the loose standards of Russian folk religion. He taught that sin was necessary for salvation, that one must descend into sin in order to truly repent and rise to grace. This doctrine, uncomfortably similar to various heretical teachings the Orthodox Church had condemned over centuries, provided convenient theological justification for behaviour that appeared anything but holy. He was observed in behaviours that scandalised the village, drinking heavily, then falling to his knees in prayer, entertaining female followers in circumstances that suggested more than spiritual counsel, making pronouncements that blended Orthodox prayer with his own cryptic additions. The local Orthodox priest viewed Rasputin with deep suspicion, and with good reason. The institutional church had always been wary of these wandering holy men who operated outside clerical authority, who claimed direct communication with the divine, who gathered followers through personal charisma rather than ecclesiastical appointment. There were investigations, accusations of belonging to the Klisti, a banned sect rumoured to practice ritual flagellation and sexual ceremonies as paths to transcendence. No charges were ever proven, but the shadow of heresy began to follow Rasputin, even as his reputation as a starets, a holy elder, continued to grow. By the early 1900s, Rasputin's reputation had spread beyond his native province. Pilgrims began travelling to Pokrovskoye to consult him. More significantly, he began making extended visits to larger towns and cities, including Kazan and eventually St. Petersburg itself. He carried with him letters of introduction from various clerics who had been impressed by his piety, or at least by his ability to inspire faith in others. These letters opened doors, allowed him access to religious circles in the capital that would otherwise have been closed to an illiterate Siberian peasant. St. Petersburg in the early 20th century was experiencing a wave of mystical and spiritual enthusiasm among certain aristocratic circles. The old certainties of Orthodox faith were being questioned by exposure to Western philosophy and Eastern religions. Spiritualism, theosophy, and various occult practices had found audiences among educated elites, seeking meaning beyond the rigid formulas of state religion. Into this atmosphere of spiritual seeking walked Rasputin, offering something that salon mystics could not: the aura of authentic peasant holiness, of folk wisdom untainted by education, of direct connection to that idealized Russian soul that intellectuals romanticized but never truly understood. His first appearances in Petersburg society occurred around 1903 or 1904. He stayed in cheap lodgings and attended services at various churches, but word of the Siberian holy man spread through networks of spiritual seekers. He was invited to drawing rooms, asked to pray over sick relatives, consulted for his insights. His rough manner and peasant speech were seen not as deficiencies but as proof of authenticity. His piercing gaze and cryptic pronouncements were interpreted as evidence of genuine mystical perception. The Grand Duchesses Militsa and Anastasia of Montenegro, who had married Romanov Grand Dukes and established themselves as patronesses of mystical seekers, became early supporters. They introduced Rasputin to other members of the extended imperial family and aristocracy. More crucially, they would eventually bring him to the attention of the Tsarina Alexandra herself, though the exact circumstances and timing of that introduction remain historically murky. What transformed Rasputin from an interesting curiosity in mystical circles to a figure of genuine power was not his spiritual insights or his peasant authenticity, but his apparent ability to heal the sick. Numerous accounts exist of people who claimed improvement or recovery after Rasputin prayed over them, laid hands upon them, or simply gazed at them with those remarkable eyes. Were these psychosomatic improvements triggered by faith and hypnotic suggestion? Were they natural recoveries mistakenly attributed to his intervention? Or did he possess some genuine ability to influence physical healing through mechanisms that medical science did not yet understand? The answer mattered less than the growing conviction among believers that Grigori Rasputin could perform miracles. And when word of his healing abilities reached a mother desperate to save her dying son, when the Tsarina herself summoned him to the bedside of the heir to the Russian throne, this strange product of Siberian mud and mystical wandering would begin his improbable ascent to power. The journey from Pokrovskoye to the Winter Palace, from illiterate peasant to confidant of emperors, should have been impossible. In any rational ordering of society, such a transformation could not occur. But Russia in the early 20th century was not ordered rationally. It was an empire of contradictions, modern industry and medieval superstition, Western education and Eastern mysticism, autocratic power and revolutionary ferment. In such a world of cracks and contradictions, a man like Rasputin could slip through gaps that should not have existed, could rise to heights that should have been unreachable. He brought with him from his years of wandering not merely a reputation for holiness, but a deep understanding of human psychology, particularly the psychology of the desperate and the faithful. He knew how to read faces and voices, how to sense what people needed to hear, how to project absolute confidence in his own spiritual authority. He knew that the powerful were as susceptible to fear and hope as the powerless, perhaps more so, because their power gave them the illusion that they could control fate itself, an illusion that made them vulnerable when fate struck in ways beyond their control. By 1905, when he was first summoned to Tsarskoye Selo, Rasputin had transformed himself from a drunken peasant youth to a figure of mystical authority, had walked thousands of miles across 2 continents, had gathered a following that spanned from Siberian villagers to Petersburg aristocrats. He stood at the threshold of unimaginable influence, one step away from the throne of the largest empire on earth. All that remained was for a child to bleed, for a mother to despair, and for a strange holy man with hypnotic eyes to place his hands upon the heir to Russia and whisper prayers that would change the course of history. The Chapter 3, the bleeding heir within the golden cage of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, behind walls guarded by the Cossacks of the Imperial Guard, beneath ceilings painted with scenes of divine glory, dwelt a secret that gnawed at the foundation of 300 years of Romanov rule. The Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, born August 12, 1904, carried in his blood a curse inherited through the intertwined royal houses of Europe, a medical condition that would bring an illiterate mystic to the pinnacle of power and contribute to the collapse of an empire. Hemophilia, the bleeding disease, passed silently through the female line while manifesting its terrible symptoms only in males. Queen Victoria of England had carried the mutated gene and passed it to her daughters, who married into the royal families of Germany, Spain and Russia, spreading the affliction across European dynasties like a slow poison, working through aristocratic bloodlines. The Tsarina Alexandra, granddaughter of Victoria, carried the gene unknowingly until it manifested in her son. The first indication of catastrophe came when Alexei was only 6 weeks old. During a routine examination, the infant began bleeding from the navel. It continued for 2 days. The court physicians applied their standard treatments: compression, ice, reassurance, and eventually the bleeding stopped, perhaps on its own, perhaps through their interventions. The doctors spoke cautiously of a tendency toward bleeding and recommended careful monitoring. They did not yet use the word hemophilia, perhaps hoping their diagnosis was wrong, perhaps unwilling to pronounce a death sentence upon the dynasty's hope. But as the boy grew, the truth became undeniable. Any minor injury could trigger hemorrhage that would not stop. A bump against furniture, a rough game, a simple nosebleed, any of these could initiate bleeding that would continue for days or weeks. The blood would pool beneath the skin, creating massive bruises. Worse still were the internal bleeds into joints and muscles, where blood would collect in spaces not meant to contain it, causing swelling, excruciating pain, and potential permanent damage. The agony of these bleeding episodes defied description. The Tsarevich would lie in his bed, his small body contorted with pain, screaming with a suffering that no medicine could ease. His joints would swell to grotesque proportions as blood collected within them. His skin would bloom with bruises that spread like dark flowers, and all the while, the finest physicians in Europe would stand helplessly by, knowing that nothing in their arsenal of treatments could stop the relentless bleeding. Modern medicine had progressed remarkably in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Doctors could perform surgeries that would have been death sentences a generation before. They could diagnose diseases through increasingly sophisticated methods. They could prescribe treatments based on growing understanding of human physiology. But haemophilia defeated them completely. The condition was understood in its mechanism, a failure of blood clotting factors, but there existed no treatment. No drug could supply what the body failed to produce. No surgical procedure could correct the genetic defect. The best physicians could offer was rest, cold compresses, and morphine for the pain. For the parents of any haemophiliac child, life became an exercise in constant vigilance and inevitable heartbreak. For the Emperor and Empress of all Russia, the burden carried additional weight. Alexei was not merely their beloved son, but the heir upon whom the dynasty's continuation depended. The Romanovs had ruled Russia since 1613, surviving palace coups, peasant rebellions, wars with foreign powers, and the assassination of Alexander II in 1881. Through all these trials, the succession had remained secure. Sons had followed fathers with reliable regularity. Nicholas II, who ascended the throne in 1894 at age 26 following his father's sudden death, had initially produced only daughters, 4 girls in succession, each birth bringing disappointment to a dynasty that required a male heir. When Alexei finally arrived in 1904, the relief was profound. Cannons thundered across the capital. Church bells rang from every steeple. The people celebrated the birth of a son who would continue the Romanov line. That joy curdled into secret anguish once the true nature of Alexei's condition became clear. The imperial couple faced an impossible situation. They could not reveal the extent of their son's illness without undermining confidence in the dynasty's future. The people believed in autocracy partly because they believed in its permanence, its God-given continuity. Revealing that the heir might not survive to adulthood, that he might live as an invalid unable to fulfill the physical demands of rulership, would shake that faith dangerously. So, a conspiracy of silence was maintained. Official court bulletins mentioned occasional injuries and periods of rest, but gave no hint of the underlying condition. The number of people who knew the full truth was kept deliberately small. Immediate family, a handful of trusted courtiers, the team of physicians who treated him, and a few discreet servants. Everyone bound by oath of secrecy, by loyalty, or by fear. The Tsarina bore the burden most heavily. Alexandra had converted from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy upon her marriage, embracing her adopted faith with the fervour of a convert. She had given herself completely to her role as empress, adopting Russian customs, speaking Russian with only a slight accent, raising her children in Orthodox piety. Yet the Russian people had never fully accepted her. She remained the German woman, in popular imagination, foreign and cold where Russians expected warmth and accessibility. Her son's condition intensified her isolation. She could not share her terror with the public, could barely discuss it even with extended family. She watched her daughters grow healthy and strong while her son, her precious only son, lived under constant threat of death from accidents too minor to prevent. Every mother fears for her children's safety, but for Alexandra that fear was magnified to unbearable intensity. Each time Alexei stumbled, each time he climbed or ran or played as boys do, she held her breath waiting for the inevitable bleeding to begin. The medical establishment offered her nothing but grim statistics and faint hope. Hemophiliac children, the doctors told her, rarely survived to adulthood. Many died in early childhood from hemorrhages triggered by accidents or dental procedures. Those who survived often lived as invalids, their joints destroyed by repeated bleeds. Even a minor surgical procedure or tooth extraction could prove fatal. The doctors could not say whether Alexei would live to reach his 10th birthday, much less his majority. Alexandra responded as mothers throughout history have responded when medicine fails their children. She turned to faith, to prayer, to desperate hope that divine intervention might succeed where human skill had failed. She increased her religious observances, spending hours in the palace chapel. She collected icons and relics, believing in their miraculous power. She consulted holy men and women, seeking those who might have access to divine healing that eluded the doctors. Her desperation made her vulnerable. Into the space created by medical failure and maternal terror, various spiritual figures attempted to insert themselves. Some were sincere believers in their own powers, others were charlatans recognizing opportunity. All promised what the doctors could not: relief from the child's suffering and hope for his survival. One such figure was a French mystic named Monsieur Philippe, who gained access to the imperial family in the early 1900s through the same Grand Duchesses who would later introduce Rasputin. Philippe claimed the ability to heal through spiritual means and to predict the future. For a time, Alexandra believed in him absolutely. When he died in 1905, leaving his promises unfulfilled, she was briefly without spiritual guidance at precisely the moment when Alexei's condition was becoming most serious. The timing of Rasputin's emergence was therefore crucial. He arrived not into a stable situation where skepticism might have prevailed, but into a crisis of desperate faith. When he was first summoned to Tsarskoye Selo in late 1905 or early 1906, accounts differ on the exact date. It was because other means had failed, because the Tsarina was willing to try anything that might save her son. The circumstances of that first meeting have been recounted in various versions, filtered through partisan recollections and historical revisionism. What is generally agreed upon is that Alexei was experiencing one of his bleeding episodes, probably in a leg or knee joint given the descriptions of his inability to walk. He had been suffering for days. The doctors had done what little they could. Morphine dulled but did not eliminate the pain. The child cried out through the nights while his mother kept vigil beside his bed, her face a mask of anguish that the court around her pretended not to see. Into this scene walked Grigori Rasputin, summoned from his lodgings in the capital to the imperial residence at Tsarskoye Selo. He entered the sick room in his rough peasant clothing, his unwashed hair hanging to his shoulders, his beard wild and unkempt. The contrast between his appearance and the refined elegance of the palace chamber could not have been more stark. Yet the Tsarina, in her desperation, saw not a crude peasant, but a potential instrument of God's mercy. Rasputin approached the bed where the child lay suffering. The doctors stepped back, some with expressions of skepticism, others with the resignation of men who knew their own limitations. The Tsarina watched with the intensity of a mother who has witnessed every treatment fail, who has exhausted hope and found it renewed through sheer force of will. What exactly transpired in those moments has been the subject of endless speculation and debate. Rasputin knelt beside the bed. He placed his rough, unwashed hands upon the child. Some accounts say on the forehead, others on the affected limb. He spoke in his Siberian dialect, mixing orthodox prayers with his own additions, speaking of God's mercy and the child's destiny. His voice was low, rhythmic, almost hypnotic in its cadence. His eyes, those remarkable grey-blue eyes that so many described as capable of piercing the soul, fixed upon the boy with unwavering intensity. The Tsarevich, who had been crying out in pain moments before, grew quiet. His tense body relaxed. The wild look of suffering in his young face eased. Within a remarkably short time, accounts vary from minutes to hours, he fell into peaceful sleep, the first restful sleep he had experienced in days. More remarkably still, when he awoke, the bleeding had stopped. The swelling in his joint began to recede. The colour returned to his face. Within days he was able to stand again, to walk, to return to the careful activities permitted to a haemophiliac child. The recovery might have occurred naturally. Bleeding episodes did eventually resolve themselves, but the timing of the improvement, coinciding so precisely with Rasputin's intervention, was impossible for Alexandra to dismiss as mere coincidence. The Tsarina fell to her knees in gratitude. She had witnessed what appeared to be a miracle. The holy man, who had come from the Siberian wilderness, had accomplished what all the learned physicians with their European training and modern methods could not. He had stopped her son's bleeding. He had lifted the child from suffering. He had, in her absolute conviction, been sent by God to preserve the dynasty. From that moment, Grigori Rasputin held a claim upon the imperial family that would prove unbreakable until his death. He became our friend in the private letters between Nicholas and Alexandra. He became the one person whose counsel the Tsarina would trust above all others, because he had performed the one service that mattered most. He had saved her son. The pattern established in that first healing would repeat itself over the coming years. Alexei would suffer another bleeding episode, from a fall, a bump, a nosebleed that would not stop. The doctors would apply their treatments and watch helplessly as the child suffered. The Tsarina would send for Rasputin, sometimes bringing him to the palace, sometimes relying on his prayers sent from a distance through telegram or telephone. And each time, whether through his physical presence or his remote intervention, the bleeding would eventually stop. Modern medical analysis has attempted to explain these apparent miracles through natural mechanisms. Hemophilia, while incurable, does see spontaneous resolution of bleeding episodes. The body's clotting factors, however deficient, do eventually succeed in forming clots sufficient to stop hemorrhage. The timing of Rasputin's interventions may simply have coincided with these natural resolutions. His calming presence may have reduced the anxiety of both mother and child, and since stress can exacerbate bleeding through various physiological mechanisms, this reduction in anxiety may have genuinely contributed to faster recovery. Some physicians have speculated that Rasputin's hypnotic abilities, which by all accounts were considerable, allowed him to induce a deep relaxation in the suffering child. This relaxation would slow the heart rate, reduce blood pressure, and thereby decrease the force of blood flow through the damaged vessels. The combination of reduced anxiety, lowered blood pressure, and the natural clotting process already underway might have created the appearance of miraculous healing. Others have suggested darker explanations, that some of the doctors, frustrated by their inability to help and threatened by Rasputin's success, may have actually been harming the child through their treatments. The medical practices of the time included applications that could worsen bleeding, manipulation of affected joints, certain medications that interfered with clotting. When Rasputin arrived and the doctors stepped back, simply ceasing harmful interventions might have allowed natural healing to proceed unimpeded. But such rational explanations mattered nothing to Alexandra. She knew what she had witnessed. She had seen her son transformed from screaming agony to peaceful sleep at Rasputin's touch. She had watched recovery follow his prayers with such consistent regularity that coincidence became impossible to credit. Whether through divine intervention, hypnotic technique, or mechanisms unknown to medical science, the result was undeniable. When her son was dying and the doctors were helpless, Rasputin could save him. This conviction, once formed, became the bedrock upon which all of Rasputin's subsequent power was built. It was not rational, could not be shaken by evidence or argument, because it was rooted in the most primal force in human nature, a mother's love for her child. Alexandra would have given anything, sacrificed anyone, betrayed any principle to preserve her son's life. If that required believing in an unwashed peasant mystic, if it required ignoring scandal and outrage, if it required defending him against all criticism from family, court and country, then that is what she would do. The Tsar, Nicholas II, approached the matter with less absolute conviction but similar practical acceptance. Nicholas was not naturally inclined toward mysticism. He was a conscientious but unimaginative man, dutiful in his orthodox faith but not given to spiritual enthusiasm. He possessed none of his wife's need for mystical certainty. Yet he could not deny what he had witnessed, that his son suffered horribly, that conventional medicine offered no relief, and that this strange holy man seemed able to provide what the doctors could not. More crucially, Nicholas loved his wife deeply and relied upon her judgment in ways that would prove politically catastrophic. He saw her devotion to their son, understood her anguish, and could not bring himself to deny her the one source of hope she had found. If Alexandra believed Rasputin was sent by God to save Alexei, then Nicholas would support that belief, even as doubts lingered in his own mind. The imperial couple's faith in Rasputin created an impossible situation for those around them. How could courtiers, ministers, or family members argue against a man who had repeatedly saved the heir's life? How could they present evidence of his scandalous behaviour when such evidence would be dismissed as malicious lies fabricated by enemies? How could they warn of his growing influence over state affairs when that influence derived from a service so profound that all political considerations paled before it? The tragedy was that Alexei's hemophilia, which should have been a private medical matter, became instead a lever moving the machinery of her empire. Because the condition had to be kept secret, Rasputin's importance could not be publicly explained or justified. The people saw only that a drunken peasant had somehow gained the Tsarina's ear. They could not know that he had saved the heir's life repeatedly. They could not understand why the imperial family tolerated behaviour that would have seen anyone else expelled from court. This secrecy created a vacuum of understanding that rumour and conspiracy theory rushed to fill. If Rasputin's power could not be explained by his healing abilities, which were kept hidden, then it must be explained by other means. He must have hypnotized the Tsarina. He must be practicing dark sorcery. He must be the Tsarina's lover. He must be a German spy. The absence of true explanation gave rise to increasingly lurid speculation, all of it more believable than the truth, that an illiterate peasant held influence over the throne because he could stop a child's bleeding when medical science could not. As Alexei grew older, his condition did not improve. Hemophilia does not fade with age. If anything, it becomes more dangerous as the child becomes more active and adventurous. The boy showed spirit and energy that constantly put him at risk. He wanted to play as other children played, to ride horses, to join his father's military reviews. Each such activity carried the threat of injury that could trigger bleeding. Each bleeding episode brought days or weeks of suffering that only Rasputin seemed able to alleviate. The year 1912 brought one of the worst crises. The imperial family was staying at their hunting lodge in Spala, Poland. Alexei, then 8 years old, was playing in a boat when he stumbled and struck himself. The blow triggered internal bleeding in his groin and abdomen. For days he suffered unbearable agony as blood pooled in his body cavity. His abdomen swelled, his temperature rose. The doctors spoke quietly among themselves about preparing the family for the worst. The Tsarina maintained a vigil beside her son's bed, watching him writhe in pain, hearing his cries. At one point he begged her to let him die rather than continue suffering. She sent telegram after telegram to Rasputin, who was at that time in his Siberian village. His responses came back. God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Whether through the comfort his words provided to the distraught mother, whose anxiety then eased and allowed her to calm the child, or through some mechanism beyond understanding, Alexei's condition began to improve after Rasputin's reassuring telegrams arrived. The bleeding stopped. The fever broke. The boy survived what had appeared to be a fatal episode. Stories of this crisis eventually reached the public, though without full details. Official bulletins spoke of an accident, and a period of concern followed by recovery. Those who knew the truth saw it as further proof of Rasputin's miraculous powers. Those who didn't know speculated and spread rumours. The secrecy that was meant to protect the dynasty instead fed the growing sense that something was deeply wrong at the heart of Russian power. By the time war came in 1914, the pattern was firmly established. Alexei would suffer. Rasputin would intervene, either in person or through telegram and prayer. Recovery would follow, the Tsarina's faith would be reinforced, and Rasputin's grip upon the imperial family would tighten another degree. The bleeding heir, that fragile boy carrying the weight of dynasty and empire in his failing blood, had become the unlikely pivot upon which Russia's fate would turn. His illness had opened the door for a peasant mystic to walk into the centre of power. His suffering had created the bond between desperate mother and holy man that no rational argument could sever. His hemophilia, that genetic curse passed through royal bloodlines, had set in motion a chain of events that would contribute to the destruction of the very dynasty it was meant to perpetuate. In the palaces and corridors of power, the secret was kept. But secrets have weight, and this secret grew heavier with each passing year. The empire staggered under burdens it could not bear: an unwinnable war, a paralysed government, a desperate people. And at the centre of it all, hidden from public view but determining so much of what transpired, lay a sick child and the strange holy man who alone seemed able to ease his suffering. The bleeding would not stop, neither Alexei's physical hemorrhages nor the metaphorical bleeding of Russia herself, draining away her strength in trenches and bread queues and revolutionary plotting. And Grigori Rasputin, the mad monk from Siberia, would ride that tide of blood toward power and infamy, his fate and Russia's fate bound together in ways that none could have foreseen, when he first placed his hands upon a suffering child and whispered prayers that seemed to work miracles. Chapter 4: The Fateful Introduction. The year 1905 marked a turning point not merely for Grigori Rasputin, but for Imperial Russia itself. Revolution had erupted in January after troops fired upon peaceful petitioners outside the Winter Palace, an event that would be remembered as Bloody Sunday. The myth of the Tsar as loving father to his people suffered mortal wounds that day, wounds that would fester for the next 12 years. Throughout that terrible year, strikes paralysed cities, peasants burned manor houses, and the empire teetered on the edge of complete collapse. In this atmosphere of chaos and fear, the imperial family retreated into increasing isolation. The Tsar issued his October manifesto promising constitutional reforms and an elected Duma, concessions that conservatives saw as weakness and revolutionaries dismissed as insufficient. The autocracy that had ruled for centuries was being forced to compromise, to bend, to acknowledge limits to its absolute power. For Nicholas and Alexandra, raised to believe in the sacred nature of Tsarist authority, these concessions felt like betrayal of their God-given duty. It was during this year of crisis, both political and personal, that the Tsarina's spiritual searching intensified. She had lost her earlier guide, Monsieur Philippe, the French mystic whose promises had proven empty. She found herself isolated at court, distrusted by the old aristocracy, blamed by some for the Tsar's perceived weakness. Her son's condition was becoming more serious as he grew older and more active. The attacks of bleeding came more frequently, lasted longer, caused more severe suffering. Through the mystical circles that flourished among certain segments of Petersburg society, whispers reached Alexandra of a new holy man, a Stranik from Siberia who had performed remarkable healings. The Grand Duchess Militsa Nikolaevna, married to the Tsar's cousin Grand Duke Pyotr, had become acquainted with Rasputin during his visits to the capital. Militsa and her sister Anastasia, both Montenegrin princesses, maintained what amounted to a salon for spiritual seekers, hosting mediums, mystics, and various practitioners of alternative spirituality. Rasputin had made a strong impression during his appearances in these circles. His rough peasant manner, rather than being seen as deficiency, was interpreted as authenticity. Here was a man unspoiled by education and European influences, a true representative of the Russian folk spirit that intellectuals romanticized. His piercing gaze and cryptic pronouncements were taken as evidence of genuine spiritual insight. Most importantly, several individuals claimed to have been healed or helped by his prayers and presence. The exact date of Rasputin's first meeting with the imperial family remains disputed by historians. Some accounts place it as early as November 1st, 1905, while others suggest later dates in 1906. What is certain is that the meeting was arranged through Militsa and Anastasia, and that it occurred during a period when Alexei was experiencing one of his bleeding episodes. The summons came to Rasputin at his lodgings in Petersburg. He was to present himself at Tsarskoye Selo, the imperial residence 15 miles south of the capital. For a peasant from Siberia, this invitation represented an impossible elevation. Tsarskoye Selo was not merely a palace, but a world unto itself. Hundreds of acres of landscaped grounds, the Baroque magnificence of the Catherine Palace, the more intimate Alexander Palace where the family actually lived, all guarded by regiments of soldiers and sealed off from common access. Rasputin made the journey by train, probably travelling third class among peasants and workers, then making his way through the elaborate security surrounding the imperial residence. How he felt approaching those golden gates we can only imagine, whether he experienced awe or saw this as the culmination of destiny prophesied in his visions. He left no personal account of that first meeting, and later recollections were filtered through years of subsequent events. He was received not in the grand reception halls, but in the private apartments of the Alexander Palace. The Tsarina had no desire to make this meeting a court event. This was personal, desperate, a mother seeking help for her dying child. The fewer witnesses, the better. When Rasputin entered the room where the imperial family waited, the contrast between his appearance and his surroundings must have been jarring. The palace rooms, even the private chambers, glowed with refined taste. Parquet floors, silk wallpaper, furniture by master craftsmen, paintings by renowned artists. Into this setting walked a man in rough peasant clothing, his hair unwashed and tangled, his beard wild, his boots crude and probably muddy. He smelled of the people, sweat and cheap tobacco, and the roads he had walked. Yet when he bowed, not with the elaborate court etiquette he had never learned, but with simple peasant respect, and when he raised his eyes to meet those of the Empress, something passed between them. Alexandra, desperate and exhausted from watching her son suffer, saw in this rough holy man a lifeline. Rasputin, with his uncanny ability to read people and situations, understood immediately the dynamic before him and the opportunity it represented. Nicholas was present as well, reserved and observant, his natural caution warring with his wife's desperate hope. The Tsar was not a man who made snap judgments, but neither was he capable of denying Alexandra anything when her anguish was so apparent. If this peasant mystic could provide comfort to his wife and relief to his son, then Nicholas would tolerate his presence, regardless of how irregular the situation appeared. The meeting was brief. Accounts suggest no more than an hour. Rasputin spoke with the imperial couple, his Siberian dialect rough and unpolished, mixing religious language with his own mystical additions. He spoke of God's mercy, of Russia's special destiny, of the imperial family as sacred vessels of divine will. These were things Alexandra desperately needed to hear, validation that her faith and her role had meaning beyond the political chaos engulfing the empire. Then he was taken to see the Tsarevich. Alexei, perhaps 4 or 5 years old at this first meeting, lay suffering from one of his bleeding episodes. The specific location of the hemorrhage is not recorded. Perhaps a joint, perhaps internal bleeding triggered by a fall or blow. What is recorded in various accounts is that the child was in significant pain, that the doctors had exhausted their limited options, and that the Tsarina was watching with the haunted expression of a mother who had seen this suffering too many times. Rasputin approached the bed with confidence that must have seemed either holy conviction or astounding arrogance. He knelt beside the suffering child, his large, rough hands that had guided ploughs and held reins and gripped walking staffs across thousands of miles, reached out to touch the delicate body of the heir to Russia. What words he spoke, what prayers he offered, what techniques he employed. These details vary in different accounts and have been embellished by decades of myth-making. Some say he simply prayed. Others claim he made passes with his hands, like a hypnotist inducing trance. Still others suggest he spoke with the child, his voice low and rhythmic, telling stories or offering comfort in ways that calmed the boy where medical interventions had failed. What cannot be disputed is the result. The child's crying ceased. His rigid body relaxed, the wild desperation in his eyes, that look of a suffering beyond his years to comprehend, faded into calm. Within a remarkably short time he slept, and his sleep was peaceful rather than the fitful unconsciousness of exhaustion and pain. The Tsarina, watching this transformation, felt something break and rebuild inside her. This peasant, this stranger, this holy man had accomplished what all the learned physicians with their European degrees could not. Whether through divine intervention or hypnotic skill or simple coincidence of timing, the effect on Alexandra was profound and permanent. She had witnessed a miracle. When Rasputin departed that first meeting, He carried with him something more valuable than gold, the absolute conviction of the Empress that he was God's instrument for her son's preservation. He had not merely helped a sick child, he had fulfilled the deepest need of a desperate mother. And in doing so, he had secured a position that would prove unassailable by any earthly power. The immediate aftermath of that first meeting saw Rasputin granted permission to return. He was not given an official position, no title, no appointment, no place in the court hierarchy. Such formal recognition would have raised questions and provoked opposition. Instead, he became an informal presence, someone the Tsarina could summon when needed, particularly when Alexei was suffering. Over the following months and years, the pattern established itself through repetition. Alexei would have a bleeding episode. The doctors would do what little they could. Alexandra would send for Rasputin. He would come to the palace, or sometimes send his intervention by telegram or letter, and the child would improve. Each repetition strengthened Alexandra's faith. Each successful healing made Rasputin more indispensable. The court began to take notice. This peasant holy man was appearing at the palace with increasing frequency. He was being received by the Empress in private audiences. Rumours began to circulate. Who was this man? What was his hold over the imperial family? The questions were whispered in drawing rooms and discussed in guarded conversations among courtiers who understood that the Tsar and Tsarina's private lives were supposed to remain private. Some at court found Rasputin's presence disturbing, but attributed it to the Tsarina's known religiosity and her fondness for mystical seekers. Russia had a long tradition of holy fools and wandering pilgrims. Perhaps this was merely another expression of that tradition, elevated by the Empress's personal piety. It seemed odd, certainly, but not yet alarming. Others recognized danger from the beginning. Count Vladimir Fredericks, minister of the imperial court, understood that allowing a peasant mystic such access to the imperial family would inevitably lead to scandal and manipulation. But Fredericks, like so many loyal servants of the throne, found himself powerless against Alexandra's conviction. How could he argue that Rasputin should be dismissed when the Empress credited him with saving her son's life? Prince Felix Yusupov, who would years later lead the conspiracy to murder Rasputin, later claimed to have been troubled from the first time he heard of the holy man's presence at court. Yusupov, member of one of Russia's wealthiest families and married to the Tsar's niece, understood instinctively that the traditional barriers separating peasant from palace existed for crucial reasons. Their dissolution threatened the entire social order, but in 1905 and 1906, these warnings went unheeded. The revolution had been suppressed, though its underlying causes remained unaddressed. The imperial family had retreated into the protective bubble of Tsarskoye Selo, increasingly isolated from both aristocracy and people. Alexei's hemophilia remained a closely guarded secret, known only to the innermost circle, and Rasputin had found the crack in the armour of the world's most powerful autocracy, a sick child and a desperate mother. He began to insert himself into the life of the imperial family beyond merely healing Alexei. He offered spiritual counsel to Alexandra, reinforcing her conviction that she and Nicholas were carrying out God's will, despite the chaos and criticism surrounding them. He prayed with the family, his rough peasant prayers mixing orthodox formulas with his own additions. He played with the children, not merely Alexei but the 4 Grand Duchesses as well, treating them with an informality that would have been unthinkable from anyone else. This informality became one of the most controversial aspects of Rasputin's presence. He addressed the Tsar and Tsarina with the familiar thou, rather than the formal you. He sat in their presence without being given permission. He touched them, placing hands on shoulders, stroking hair, embracing them, in ways that violated every protocol of imperial dignity. To Alexandra, these violations were not offences but evidence of spiritual authenticity. Rasputin treated them as fellow souls before God, rather than as earthly potentates, and in her mystical worldview, this was proper and holy. To observers at court, however, Rasputin's behaviour appeared outrageous and dangerous. The imperial dignity, that aura of sacred authority that legitimised autocratic rule, required strict maintenance of hierarchies and protocols. When a peasant could slap the Tsar on the back and call him by a familiar name, what did that say about the nature of imperial authority? When the Empress would kiss the hand of this unwashed wanderer, what did that say about the social order that placed her above all other Russian women? These concerns were raised carefully and obliquely by various courtiers and family members. They were dismissed by Alexandra as the complaints of those who did not understand true spirituality, who were trapped in worldly thinking, who could not see that God worked through humble vessels. Nicholas, caught between his wife's conviction and the growing unease of those around him, chose as he would so often choose, to support Alexandra and hope that somehow the situation would resolve itself. By 1906, Rasputin's position was established. He divided his time between Petersburg and his home in Pokrovskoye, but he could be summoned to the capital whenever needed. He had become, in effect if not in title, the imperial family's private spiritual advisor and the one person who could reliably ease Alexei's suffering. This position, born from medical crisis and maternal desperation, would serve as the foundation for everything that followed: the scandals, the political interference, the growing public outrage, and ultimately his role in the dynasty's collapse. The fateful introduction had occurred. The peasant mystic and the imperial family were now bound together by threads of faith, desperation, and apparent miracle. Those threads would prove stronger than any rational argument, more durable than any scandal, more binding than any official position. They would hold until death itself severed them, and by then it would be far too late to save the empire that Rasputin's critics believed he was helping to destroy. In the private apartments of the Alexander Palace, the Tsarina kept a photograph of Rasputin among her most precious possessions. She looked at it often. This image of the rough holy man who had saved her son. She prayed before it as before an icon, and she resolved that whatever criticism might come, whatever scandal might erupt, she would never abandon the man God had sent to preserve her family and, in her mind, the dynasty and Russia itself. The introduction was complete, the stage was set, and the tragedy that would unfold over the next decade had begun its inexorable progression toward blood and revolution and the end of 300 years of Romanov rule. Chapter 5: The Holy Devil Takes Root. The years between 1906 and 1914, before the Great War would consume Russia and accelerate all processes of decay, saw Rasputin's transformation from occasional spiritual consultant to a permanent and increasingly controversial fixture in the imperial family's life. These years witnessed the gradual revelation to wider circles of his influence, the accumulation of scandals that would blacken his reputation, and the establishment of patterns that would prove catastrophic when war brought crisis that demanded competent governance. Rasputin did not reside permanently at the palace. No formal position was ever created for him, no official role ever defined. Instead, he maintained rooms in Petersburg, usually in modest apartments in less fashionable districts. His living arrangements were simple, almost squalid by the standards of those who moved in imperial circles. A few rooms furnished with the bare necessities, icons on the walls, the smell of cheap incense and cheaper wine. Here he held court in his own fashion, receiving the stream of petitioners that his connection to the throne inevitably attracted. For in Petersburg society, word had spread that this peasant holy man possessed the ear of the empress. Those seeking favours, appointments, interventions in bureaucratic matters, all began to make their way to Rasputin's door. Some came seeking spiritual counsel, believing genuinely in his powers. Others came as cynical manipulators, understanding that access to power is itself a form of power, and that even a peasant's access to the throne was worth cultivating. Rasputin received them all with the same rough informality. A prince and a prostitute might find themselves waiting together in his cramped apartment. All social hierarchies temporarily dissolved in this strange space, where a Siberian peasant held more influence than men with ancient titles and vast estates. He would emerge from his bedroom, often apparently just awakened regardless of the hour, his hair wild and his clothing dishevelled, and grant audiences that mix spiritual instruction with practical advice and cryptic pronouncements that could be interpreted in multiple ways. His behaviour during these audiences often shocked those accustomed to more conventional religious figures. He would drink wine while discussing theology. He would make crude jokes mixed with mystical insights. He would sometimes touch female visitors in ways that suggested more than spiritual connection, a hand lingering on an arm, an embrace that lasted too long, suggestions that blurred the line between holy man and predator. Yet many of these women became devoted followers. They defended Rasputin against all criticism, insisted that his touch was healing rather than improper, interpreted his crudeness as divine simplicity. Some claimed he had cured them of ailments. Others felt he had saved their marriages or guided their children. The psychological dynamic was complex, a mixture of genuine faith, the prestige of association with someone close to the throne, and perhaps the seductive quality of transgression, of experiencing behavior from a holy man that violated all conventional boundaries. The men who came to Rasputin sought more material benefits, appointments to positions, favorable decisions in bureaucratic disputes, introduction to higher circles of power. Rasputin, for his part, discovered that he enjoyed having this influence. The peasant who had grown up in Siberian poverty now found himself in the position of granting favors to men who would never have acknowledged his existence under normal circumstances. He collected supplicants and supporters, building a network of obligation that extended throughout Petersburg society. More dangerously, he began to involve himself in matters of government appointment and policy. When someone sought his help in obtaining a position, Rasputin would mention it to the Tsarina during his visits to the palace. Alexandra, believing absolutely in his spiritual wisdom and grateful beyond measure for his healing of Alexei, would in turn mention these recommendations to Nicholas. The Tsar, exhausted by the demands of rule and increasingly dependent on his wife's counsel, would often follow these recommendations, either to please Alexandra or because the constant pressure of decision-making had worn down his capacity for independent judgment. The result was a slow corruption of the appointment process. Men rose to positions of power not because of competence or loyalty or noble character, but because they had curried favour with Rasputin. Some paid him outright bribes, money, gifts, promises of future benefits. Others simply flattered him, played to his vanity, encouraged his sense of importance. The most cynical understood that the way to gain the Tsar's ear was through the Tsarina, and the way to the Tsarina was through the holy man she believed God had sent. This corruption might have remained relatively contained had Rasputin exercised some discretion in his personal behaviour. But discretion was foreign to his nature. He seemed to revel in scandal, as if deliberately testing the limits of his protector's faith. His nightly activities became the subject of intense scrutiny by both the Okhrana, the secret police who maintained surveillance on him ostensibly for his own protection, and by private citizens outraged by his behaviour. The reports accumulated in police files painted a picture of systematic debauchery. Rasputin would emerge from his apartment in the evening and make his way to various restaurants and taverns. He would drink heavily, vodka mostly, but also wine, consuming quantities that would have felled ordinary men. As he drank, he would become increasingly loud and crude, boasting of his influence, making sexual propositions to women in the establishment, sometimes exposing himself or engaging in other behaviour that ordinarily would have resulted in arrest. The bathhouses of Petersburg, traditional gathering places where social mixing occurred more freely than in other venues, became particular sites of scandal. Rasputin frequented these establishments, and numerous accounts emerged of inappropriate behaviour, touching women without permission, making lewd suggestions, claiming that sin was necessary for redemption and that he was willing to help women achieve the sin that would make their repentance meaningful. This last claim reflected Rasputin's idiosyncratic theology, which borrowed from various heretical traditions that Orthodox authorities had spent centuries suppressing. He taught that one could not truly repent without first sinning deeply, that redemption required descent into transgression. Whether he genuinely believed this doctrine or merely used it as justification for behaviour he would have engaged in regardless is impossible to determine. What is certain is that his teaching provided theological cover for actions that appeared anything but holy. Stories spread through Petersburg society like disease through a crowded slum, that Rasputin had seduced a respected merchant's wife, that he had been seen emerging drunk from a notorious brothel, that he had performed some sort of ritual with female followers that involved nudity and flagellation. How many of these stories were true? How many were exaggerated and how many were complete fabrications created by his enemies is impossible to establish with certainty. What mattered was that they were believed, that they accumulated into a portrait of Rasputin as the holy devil, a man who somehow combined genuine spiritual power with moral corruption of the deepest kind. The Okhrana surveillance reports, which still exist in archives, provide some documentary evidence of Rasputin's activities. These reports, compiled by agents who followed him nightly, describe drinking, crude language, and encounters with women that the agents interpreted as sexual in nature. However, the reports also reveal the limitations of external observation. The agents could describe what they saw, but could not penetrate the motives or understand the relationship dynamics involved. They reported facts without comprehending context. When these reports were brought to the attention of the Tsarina, she responded with absolute rejection. The reports were lies, she insisted, fabrications by enemies of the throne who sought to undermine her faith and destroy the man God had sent to save her son. She developed elaborate theories of conspiracy. Jews, revolutionaries, court rivals, foreign powers, all working together to blacken Rasputin's reputation because they knew he was the dynasty's protector. This response reveals the psychological trap that had closed around Alexandra. She had invested so completely in Rasputin, had tied her son's survival so absolutely to his intervention, that any doubt in him threatened to unravel her entire worldview. If Rasputin was not the holy man she believed him to be, then her faith was misplaced, her judgment was flawed, her son's survival might not be miraculous but merely fortunate. These possibilities were psychologically unbearable. Therefore Rasputin must be holy. The criticisms must be lies, and those who criticized must be enemies. Nicholas, caught between the evidence compiled by his own security services and his wife's unwavering faith, chose characteristically to avoid confrontation. He would look at the surveillance reports with troubled expression, would sometimes mention concerns to Alexandra, but would ultimately defer to her judgment. The Tsar, who commanded millions, found himself unable to command his own household, unable to remove a peasant mystic whose presence was causing scandal that undermined the throne's dignity. Members of the extended Romanov family began to express alarm. Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, the Tsar's cousin and a respected military commander, detested Rasputin and made his views known. The Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, Nicholas's mother, begged her son to send the holy man away before irreparable damage was done. Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, Alexandra's own sister, attempted to reason with her, pointing out that whether Rasputin was holy or not, the scandal surrounding him was harming the monarchy. All these interventions failed. Alexandra interpreted them as attacks on her faith and on the man who had saved her son. She withdrew further into isolation, surrounding herself only with those who supported her belief in Rasputin or who were too intimidated to express doubt. The imperial family's social circle contracted to a small group of believers and sycophants, while the rest of the court watched with growing horror as the situation deteriorated. The Orthodox Church hierarchy viewed Rasputin with deep suspicion bordering on hostility. Bishop Hermogen of Saratov and the monk Iliador, both initially impressed by Rasputin, eventually turned against him after witnessing behaviour they considered incompatible with genuine holiness. In 1911, they confronted Rasputin directly, demanding he reform his ways and threatening to expose him. The confrontation apparently became physical. Accounts suggest Hermogen beat Rasputin with a wooden cross while Iliador held him. Rasputin responded by running to his protectors. He appeared at the palace with tales of persecution by jealous clergy, who could not accept that God spoke through a simple peasant rather than through church hierarchies. Alexandra, predictably, believed him completely, and used her influence to have both Hermogen and Iliador removed from their positions and exiled. The incident demonstrated the extent of Rasputin's power. He could now destroy the careers of senior church officials who opposed him. The year 1912 brought both Rasputin's greatest triumph and the first serious threat to his position. The triumph came during Alexei's crisis at Spala, when Rasputin's telegrams apparently helped the boy recover from what seemed a fatal bleeding episode. This event reinforced Alexandra's faith so completely that it became nearly religious in its intensity. The threat came from growing public awareness of Rasputin's existence and influence. Newspapers, when censors permitted, began publishing veiled references to dark forces at court. The Duma, though politically weak, provided a forum where deputies could question government appointments and hint at scandalous influences on the throne. Society gossip, always vicious in Petersburg, turned Rasputin into a figure of legend, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes sinister, always controversial. A particular scandal erupted when Iliador, the exiled monk, published letters that Rasputin had allegedly received from the Tsarina and the Grand Duchesses. These letters, addressed to our friend and signed with intimate diminutives, were open to scandalous interpretation. Though the letters probably contained nothing more than the effusive religious sentiment common in Alexandra's correspondence, their publication allowed critics to suggest improper relationships between Rasputin and the imperial women. The scandal forced Nicholas to take action. In 1912, he sent Rasputin back to Siberia, ostensibly for a period of prayer and retreat. For several months, Rasputin remained in Pokrovskoye. Away from the capital and the court, Alexandra was bereft, writing desperate letters to her husband begging for our friend's return. But political pressure, particularly from the Duma and from senior officials, kept Rasputin in exile. The exile did not last. Alexei inevitably suffered another bleeding episode. The Tsarina, frantic, sent telegrams to Siberia. Rasputin's responses provided comfort, and whether coincidentally or not, the boy recovered. Alexandra insisted he must return. Nicholas, exhausted by his wife's pleading and convinced by his son's recovery that Rasputin's presence was genuinely necessary, permitted the return. By 1913, Rasputin was back in Petersburg, his position if anything strengthened by the failed attempt to remove him. He had survived opposition from church hierarchs, from family members, from public scandal. He had proven himself essential to the imperial family. His network of supporters and beneficiaries had grown, and most importantly, the Tsarina's faith in him had been reinforced rather than shaken by the attacks. The last peaceful year before the Great War saw Rasputin at the height of his influence over the imperial household. He visited the palace regularly. He corresponded with Alexandra almost daily when not present. His recommendations on appointments carried decisive weight. His prophecies and spiritual guidance shaped the Tsarina's worldview and, through her, increasingly shaped the Tsar's decisions. Yet this same period saw the growth of an organised opposition to him among various factions of the elite, conservative nobles who saw him as a symbol of the regime's decay. Military officers who resented his interference in command decisions, liberals who viewed him as evidence that autocracy had become not merely oppressive but absurd, revolutionaries who used him as propaganda. Look at your rulers, bowing before a drunken peasant. The root had taken hold, grown deep, and now could not be easily extracted. Rasputin had become part of the foundation of the imperial family's daily life, as essential in Alexandra's mind as prayer or food. His presence at court, which should have been temporary and limited, had become permanent and expansive. The peasant holy man from Siberia now walked the corridors of power as if born to them, touching the lives of the mighty with his rough hands, speaking with the voice of one who believed himself God's chosen instrument. And perhaps, in his own mind, that is exactly what he had become. The strange spiritual journey that had begun in Pokrovskoye, that had taken him thousands of miles to Mount Athos in Jerusalem, that had forged in him some combination of genuine faith and remarkable psychological insight, that journey had delivered him to a destiny that would have seemed impossible to the young peasant boy playing on the banks of the Tura River. He stood now at the centre of the Russian Empire's web of power, and his hand, whether deliberately or through the unintended consequences of his actions, was pulling on threads that would ultimately unravel the entire structure. The holy devil had taken root, and the fruit his presence would bear would prove bitter beyond imagining. As Chapter 6, the Tsarina's unshakable faith. To comprehend Rasputin's power requires understanding the woman who granted it to him. Alexandra Feodorovna, Empress of all Russia, was perhaps the most tragic figure in the entire drama that consumed the Romanov dynasty. Born Princess Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt in 1872, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she came to Russia as a bride carrying both the blood royal of Europe and, unknowingly, the genetic curse of hemophilia that would doom her son and dynasty. Her early life in Germany had been marked by tragedy. Her mother, Princess Alice, died when Alex was only 6 years old, a victim of diphtheria caught while nursing her own children through the disease. This early loss left permanent scars, instilling in the young princess a melancholic temperament and a tendency toward intense, almost desperate attachments to those she loved. She grew into a beautiful but serious young woman, tall and graceful, with striking blue eyes and reddish gold hair, but lacking the easy social charm that court life demanded. Her marriage to Nicholas, heir to the Russian throne, was a love match, rare among royalty, where dynastic considerations usually trumped personal affection. They met when she visited Russia for the first time in 1889, and Nicholas fell completely in love with her. His diary entries from that period revealed genuine passion, unusual for the usually reserved young man. Alex was more hesitant, troubled by the prospect of leaving her homeland and converting from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy, a conversion that would be required if she were to marry the heir to the throne. She finally accepted Nicholas's proposal in 1894, shortly before his father Alexander III died unexpectedly, catapulting Nicholas to the throne at age 26. The wedding took place less than a month after Alexander's death, giving Alexandra's arrival in Russia an ominous quality. She entered her new country dressed in mourning, bringing what Russians would later see as an ill omen. The people called her the funeral bride, and the name carried a prophecy that would prove terrifyingly accurate. From the beginning, Alexandra struggled in her new role. The Russian court was notoriously complex, bound by elaborate etiquette, and dominated by aristocratic families who had served the Romanovs for generations. These established families viewed the German princess with suspicion and condescension. She was foreign, serious where they expected charm, awkward where they expected grace. Her Russian, though she worked hard to perfect it, retained a slight German accent that would never completely disappear. More damaging was her shyness, which Russians interpreted as coldness or arrogance. Alexandra suffered from what would today be recognized as severe social anxiety. Large gatherings terrified her. She would freeze up, unable to make the small talk and gracious gestures that royalty was expected to provide. Where her mother-in-law, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, could work a room with effortless charm, Alexandra stood rigid and uncomfortable, apparently aloof from the very people she was supposed to lead as empress. The Russian people, who had loved the warm and accessible Maria Feodorovna, never warmed to Alexandra. They called her the German woman, with increasing hostility as years passed. Every misstep, every failure of Nicholas's reign was attributed partly to her malign influence. The fact that she had brought no fortune to Russia, her family in Hesse was not particularly wealthy, and that her blood carried the hemophilia curse seemed to confirm that she had brought nothing but misfortune to her adopted land. She found solace in her conversion to Orthodoxy, which she embraced with the fervour of a true believer. Unlike many royal converts who merely went through the motions for political necessity, Alexandra seemed to find genuine spiritual fulfillment in the Russian church. She collected icons, spent hours in prayer, observed fasts and religious festivals with scrupulous devotion. Her religiosity, rather than endearing her to the Russian people, seemed excessive even by the standards of a devout nation. She was seen as fanatical, driven by an intensity that made others uncomfortable. Her marriage to Nicholas remained loving but became increasingly claustrophobic for both of them. They withdrew into each other, creating a small world consisting of their immediate family and a shrinking circle of trusted intimates. The Tsar and Tsarina would spend evenings reading aloud to each other, taking long walks in the palace grounds, playing with their children in a domestic cocoon that sealed them off from the realities of the empire they ruled. The birth of 4 daughters in succession, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, brought joy but also mounting pressure. An empire required a male heir. With each daughter's birth, Alexandra felt the weight of failure. She consulted doctors, prayed desperately, made pilgrimages to holy sites seeking divine intervention for a son. When Alexei finally arrived in 1904, her relief and joy were profound. She had fulfilled her primary duty as empress. The dynasty would continue. Then came the diagnosis of hemophilia, and Alexandra's world collapsed into nightmare. The disease was her fault. She had brought it from her family line, passed it unknowingly to her son. The guilt she felt was crushing. She had not merely failed to provide a healthy heir, she had cursed him with a condition that would cause unbearable suffering and likely early death. This guilt, combined with her already intense maternal love, created an emotional burden that would warp her judgment for the rest of her life. She became obsessively protective of Alexei. The boy was not allowed normal boyhood activities. He was watched constantly, cushioned against any accident, isolated from other children who might play too roughly. Yet despite all precautions, the bleeding episodes came, inevitable, unpredictable, devastating. Each time, Alexandra would keep vigil by his bed, watching him scream in agony, begging God for mercy, feeling the weight of her genetic curse killing her son by degrees. The medical establishment's inability to help drove her increasingly toward alternative remedies and spiritual intervention. She had already been inclined toward mysticism. Her time in Germany had exposed her to various spiritual movements, and her personality was drawn to the absolute certainties that faith could provide. Her son's illness intensified this tendency into something approaching desperation. She would try anything, believe anyone, grasp at any possibility that offered hope where science offered none. Into this void of desperation walked Grigori Rasputin, and he filled it so completely that he became, in Alexandra's mind, literally irreplaceable. He was not merely someone who helped her son, he was God's chosen instrument for her son's preservation. Doubting Rasputin, therefore, meant doubting God's mercy itself. It meant abandoning the one source of hope that had proven effective when all else failed. It meant accepting that her son might die because she'd not had sufficient faith to protect the man God had sent. This theological conviction, once established, became unshakable. Every attack on Rasputin became, in Alexandra's mind, an attack on divine providence. Every piece of evidence suggesting his unworthiness was transformed into proof of conspiracy by enemies who sought to destroy the dynasty by removing its protector. She developed an elaborate worldview in which dark forces, sometimes identified as Jews, sometimes as revolutionaries, sometimes as jealous nobles or foreign powers, were constantly plotting against Russia, against the Tsar, against her family, and especially against Rasputin, because he was the only one who understood the spiritual truth of the dynasty's sacred mission. Her correspondence from this period reveals a mind increasingly detached from reality, constructing narratives that justified her faith regardless of evidence. In her letters to Nicholas, who spent increasing amounts of time away at military headquarters after war began in 1914, she would write about Rasputin constantly. Our friend was worried about such and such appointment. Our friend had a vision about military strategy. Our friend believed certain ministers were traitors. Our friend prayed for Nicholas and sent his blessing. These letters, written in a mixture of Russian and English, often with intimate baby talk diminutives, reveal the complete dominance Rasputin had achieved over Alexandra's thinking. She filtered every decision through the question of what our friend would advise. She interpreted every event through the lens of whether it aligned with Rasputin's prophecies. She measured people's loyalty not by their service to Russia, but by their attitude toward the holy man she believed God had sent. More troublingly, she had developed a conviction that she and Nicholas were engaged in a sacred mission to preserve autocracy against all attempts at reform or limitation. She believed that the October Manifesto of 1905, which had created the Duma and established some constitutional constraints on imperial power, was a sinful betrayal of their coronation oath to rule as unlimited autocrats. She constantly urged Nicholas to be stronger, to ignore his ministers' advice, to rule as his ancestors had ruled, with absolute authority accountable only to God. Rasputin reinforced these convictions. He told Alexandra what she desperately needed to hear, that she was right, that her faith was true, that her enemies were wrong, that the dynasty's mission was sacred and would ultimately triumph. He spoke to her deepest needs and fears with uncanny precision, as if he could read her soul. Whether this was genuine mystical insight or merely the practiced technique of someone expert in manipulation mattered not at all to Alexandra. The effect was the same. She felt understood, validated and strengthened in her convictions by the only person she completely trusted outside her immediate family. The intensity of Alexandra's attachment to Rasputin alarmed even those who remained loyal to the throne. Her personal secretary, Anna Vyrobova, became the primary channel of communication between the Tsarina and Rasputin. Vyrobova, a plump and not particularly intelligent woman, shared Alexandra's devotion to the holy man and facilitated their relationship with complete dedication. The three of them formed a tight circle that excluded even Nicholas to some degree. The Tsar was kept informed, but the emotional intensity of Alexandra and Vyrobova's faith in Rasputin was something he observed rather than fully shared. The question inevitably arose, whispered in society and sometimes shouted in anonymous pamphlets. Was there a sexual relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin? The accusation was explosive, representing not merely personal scandal but potential illegitimacy of the heir and treason of the highest order. The evidence suggests the accusation was false. Alexandra's personality, Her rigid morality, her intense devotion to Nicholas, all argue against such a relationship. More practically, she was under constant observation by servants, guards, and courtiers. Carrying on an affair would have been nearly impossible even if she had desired to do so. But the relationship was intimate in other ways that contemporaries found equally troubling. Rasputin would visit Alexandra's private chambers. He would sit close to her, touch her hand, stroke her hair. He spoke to her with familiar pronouns and terms of endearment. He heard her confessions of fear and weakness. The emotional intimacy, the psychological dependence, was in some ways deeper than physical intimacy would have been. Rasputin had access to Alexandra's inner world in ways that perhaps even Nicholas did not. This psychological grip allowed Rasputin to shape not merely Alexandra's spiritual life but her political judgment. When government ministers expressed doubts about military strategy or suggested reforms to address Russia's mounting problems, Alexandra would consult Rasputin. His response, usually opposition to any change, support for whatever strengthened autocratic power, and denunciation of reformers as traitors, would become her position. She would then bombard Nicholas with letters urging him to dismiss competent ministers and replace them with men loyal to our friend. The result was catastrophic governance, especially after 1914 when war placed impossible demands on the Russian state. Ministers were appointed and dismissed with bewildering frequency, creating instability at the highest levels of government. Men rose to positions of power not because of ability, but because they had cultivated Rasputin's favour. Competent officials who questioned this system were removed, while incompetents and corrupt sycophants were elevated. Alexandra seemed blind to the damage this was causing. In her mind, she was helping Nicholas fulfill his sacred duty as autocrat. She believed she was being strong where he was too gentle, protecting him from false counsellors, ensuring that God's will, as revealed through Rasputin, was carried out. The more people warned her about the danger, the more convinced she became that she was right and her critics were enemies. Her letters to Nicholas during the war years reveal a woman living in an alternate reality. While Russia bled in the trenches, while cities starved, while revolution built in the streets and factories, Alexandra wrote about Rasputin's latest insights. About which ministers needed to be dismissed for insufficient loyalty, about how strong Nicholas must be in resisting pressure for reform. She urged him to ignore the Duma, to dismiss the concerns of his generals, to trust only her judgment and Rasputin's guidance. Nicholas, weak-willed and exhausted, increasingly followed her advice. He loved her deeply and could not bear her distress when he disagreed with her. He was also isolated from reality by the nature of autocratic power, surrounded by yes-men, receiving filtered information, making decisions without feedback that might correct his errors. When the woman he loved most in the world told him that God's chosen messenger advised a certain course of action, he found it easier to comply than to resist. The tragedy was that Alexandra genuinely believed she was saving Russia. She saw herself not as the destroyer of the dynasty, but as its protector. She thought she was being strong and faithful and loyal. Every decision she influenced, every minister she helped to dismiss or appoint, every piece of advice she extracted from Rasputin and passed to Nicholas, all of it was done in absolute conviction that she was serving God's will and Russia's interest. This conviction made her impervious to reason or evidence. When family members tried to intervene, she saw betrayal. When ministers expressed concern, she saw conspiracy. When the public expressed outrage at Rasputin's influence, she saw the ignorant masses misled by revolutionaries and Jews. She constructed an airtight worldview in which every criticism confirmed her righteousness, and every disaster proved the necessity of faith in our friend. Her relationship with her own sister, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, illustrates the completeness of her delusion. Elizabeth, widow of Grand Duke Sergei, who had been assassinated by revolutionaries in 1905, had responded to her husband's death by founding a religious order and dedicating herself to charitable works. She was genuinely holy in ways that Rasputin never was, selfless, devoted to the poor, living in voluntary poverty despite her wealth. She loved her sister Alexandra and tried desperately to convince her that Rasputin was dangerous. Elizabeth travelled to Tsarskoye Selo and spent hours pleading with Alexandra to send Rasputin away. She spoke not from political calculation, but from genuine concern for her sister's soul and Russia's fate. Alexandra listened coldly and then dismissed her, saying that those who did not understand our friend could not understand God's plan. The sisters never reconciled. Elizabeth would be murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918, thrown alive down a mine shaft, one more victim of the revolution that Rasputin's influence had helped to make inevitable. As war dragged on and Russia's situation deteriorated, Alexandra's letters to Nicholas became increasingly frantic and divorced from reality. She wrote of Rasputin blessing military icons that would protect regiments, of his visions predicting victory, of how the soldiers would fight better if they knew our friend was praying for them. She seemed unable to grasp that soldiers dying in their millions from lack of ammunition and incompetent leadership were not concerned with a peasant mystic's prayers. In September 1915, Nicholas made the catastrophic decision to take personal command of the armies at the front, leaving Alexandra effectively in charge of the government in Petrograd. This decision, made partly because Alexandra and Rasputin had urged it, placed her in direct control of ministerial appointments and policy decisions. Over the next 15 months, she would preside over a revolving door of ministers, each appointed or dismissed based largely on Rasputin's recommendations and her own increasingly unhinged judgment. The ministerial leapfrog, as contemporaries called it, saw 4 different prime ministers in 16 months, along with constant changes in other key positions. Capable men were replaced by mediocrities, reformers were replaced by reactionaries. Anyone who expressed doubt about Rasputin's influence was marked for removal. The government lost all coherence and effectiveness precisely when Russia needed strong, stable leadership most desperately. Alexandra seemed to believe she was channeling strength to Nicholas, helping him rule as a true autocrat. Her letters from this period are filled with religious language and political advice inextricably mixed. Be Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Emperor Paul, crush them all, she would write, urging him to ignore calls for reform and rule with absolute authority. She signed her letters, Your Wifey, and Sonny, but the content was the political direction of an empire at war, filtered through the advice of a peasant mystic and the delusions of a woman who had lost touch with reality. The unshakable quality of her faith in Rasputin becomes most clear in her response to the mounting evidence of his scandalous behaviour. The Okhrana surveillance reports piled up, documenting drinking, crude behaviour, possible sexual exploitation. Newspapers, when censors slipped, printed stories of the dark forces at court. The Duma openly debated Rasputin's influence. Family members begged her to listen to reason. She dismissed it all. The reports were lies fabricated by the police who opposed our friend. The newspapers were controlled by Jews and revolutionaries spreading slander. The Duma deputies were traitors seeking to undermine the autocracy. Her family members were misguided or jealous. Every piece of evidence against Rasputin became, in her mind, further proof of the conspiracy against him, and thus against Russia itself. This psychological mechanism, where evidence against a belief serves to strengthen rather than weaken it, is well understood by modern psychology, but was merely tragic in its real-time unfolding. Alexandra had invested so completely in Rasputin, had tied her son's survival and her family's fate so absolutely to his continued presence and power, that accepting doubt would have meant psychological collapse. Better to reshape reality, to construct elaborate conspiracies, to dismiss all contrary evidence, than to face the possibility that she had been catastrophically wrong. The relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin was never sexual, but it was perhaps more dangerous because it was genuinely believed on her part to be holy. A sexual affair might have been exposed and ended with scandal, but without destroying her faith in autocracy and divine right. Instead, she had made Rasputin into a pillar of her religious worldview, a necessary component of her understanding of God's plan for Russia. Removing that pillar would bring down the entire structure of her beliefs. In the winter of 1916, as Russia staggered under the weight of war, as bread queues lengthened and revolutionary sentiment grew, as even loyal servants of the throne recognized that disaster loomed, Alexandra remained serenely convinced that faith in God and obedience to our friend would see them through. She wrote to Nicholas about how they must be strong, how they must trust in divine providence, how Rasputin's prayers would protect them. She could not see, or refuse to see, that her unshakable faith was itself one of the forces destroying the dynasty she sought to preserve. Her love for her son, twisted by guilt and desperation into absolute dependence on Rasputin, had made her an instrument of the regime's destruction. The most tragic aspect was her sincerity. She genuinely believed she was serving God and Russia. She thought herself strong and faithful. She could not comprehend that her faith, unshakable as it was, had become the faith of a fanatic leading herself and her family toward doom. When Rasputin was finally murdered in December 1916, Alexandra's grief was profound and genuine. She had lost not merely an advisor, but the one person she believed could save her son and dynasty. She mourned him as a martyr, insisted on his burial near the palace, placed icons and letters in his coffin. Even as Russia collapsed around her, even as revolution exploded in the streets, she maintained her faith that our friend had been God's messenger, and that his death was part of the catastrophe his enemies had brought upon the nation. That faith would last until her own death in that basement in Ekaterinburg, where she died alongside her husband and children, the dynasty ending in blood as Rasputin had prophesied. In her final months of captivity, she still spoke of him, still believed he had been sent by God, still could not see that her unshakable faith had been one of the forces that made their murder inevitable. Alexandra Feodorovna remains one of history's most tragic figures, a woman whose love for her son and faith in divine providence became weapons that destroyed everything she sought to protect. Her unshakable faith, which should have been a strength, became a fatal weakness because it was invested in the wrong object. And Grigori Rasputin, who had recognized her vulnerability and filled the void in her desperate heart, rode that faith to power and infamy, becoming in the process one of the most controversial figures in Russian history. Chapter 7. The War and the Wanderer's Meddling. The summer of 1914 arrived in Petersburg with unusual warmth and the promise of prosperity. The city's fashionable districts buzzed with plans for the season: balls, theatre performances, trips to summer estates. The empire, despite continuing social tensions and the unresolved problem of Rasputin's influence, seemed stable. The tercentenary celebrations of 1913, marking 300 years of Romanov rule, had been carried off with impressive pageantry. The dynasty appeared secure. Then, on June 28th, in the distant Balkan city of Sarajevo, a Serbian nationalist fired the shots that would destroy the old world. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife were assassinated, setting in motion a chain of ultimatums, mobilizations and declarations of war that would, within weeks, drag all of Europe into the most destructive conflict yet known to human history. Russia's entry into what contemporaries would soon call the Great War was greeted with patriotic enthusiasm that briefly united the fractured empire. When Nicholas appeared on the balcony of the Winter Palace on August 2nd, 1914, to announce that Russia would defend her Serbian brothers against Austrian aggression, the vast crowd in Palace Square fell to its knees in spontaneous demonstration of loyalty. The strikes and revolutionary agitation that had marked previous months evaporated as workers and intellectuals, peasants and nobles, all rallied behind the war effort. Even the name of the capital was changed to purge it of Germanic influences. St. Petersburg, that name bestowed by Peter the Great, became Petrograd, a more Slavic designation meant to emphasize Russian identity in the struggle against Teutonic powers. The symbolic purification reflected genuine hatred of Germany that swept through Russian society, fueled by propaganda that portrayed the enemy as barbaric Huns threatening Slavic civilization. Rasputin opposed the war from the beginning. His opposition came not from political analysis but from mystical conviction mixed with peasant practicality. He warned that war would bring catastrophe to Russia, would drown the land in blood, would destroy the dynasty. Whether this was genuine prophecy or simply the obvious prediction that massive war would cause suffering, his warnings went unheeded. Nicholas, pressured by military commanders eager to prove Russia's strength and by alliance obligations to France and Britain, committed the empire to a conflict for which it was fundamentally unprepared. The initial campaign seemed to justify optimism. Russian armies swept into East Prussia and Galicia, winning victories that suggested the war might be brief and glorious. But these early successes masked fundamental weaknesses. The Russian military was enormous. Millions of men could be mobilized, but poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and led by commanders who mixed occasional brilliance with frequent incompetence. The disaster came in the spring and summer of 1915. At Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, German forces destroyed entire Russian armies through superior tactics and devastating artillery. At Gorlice Tarnov, an Austro-German offensive smashed through Russian lines, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and forcing a retreat that abandoned all of Galicia and Russian Poland. The defeats were catastrophic, revealing that Russia's massive armies were no match for German military efficiency. Soldiers went into battle without rifles, told to pick up weapons from the dead. Artillery fired a few shells and then fell silent for lack of ammunition. Medical services collapsed under the flood of wounded. Supply lines broke down, leaving troops hungry even when food existed in rear areas. The defeat stemmed not from lack of bravery — Russian soldiers fought with desperate courage — but from fundamental failures of organisation, supply and command. As the military situation deteriorated, Russia's home front began to crack under the strain. The empire's economy, never particularly strong, could not sustain both military production and civilian needs. Factories converted to munitions manufacturing, reducing production of consumer goods. Peasant men were drafted by the millions, removing labour from agriculture. The railway system, when adequate even in peacetime, groaned under the burden of moving troops and supplies, causing civilian transportation to break down. By 1916, the effects reached even the capital. Bread became scarce, then expensive, then available only after hours in queue. Fuel shortages left apartments cold in the brutal winter. Inflation destroyed the savings of the middle class and reduced workers' real wages to starvation levels. The war that had begun with patriotic enthusiasm had become a grinding nightmare of suffering with no end in sight. Into this crisis, Rasputin inserted himself with increasing boldness. His initial opposition to the war, once dismissed as the mystical ramblings of a peasant holy man, began to seem prescient as casualty lists grew and defeats accumulated. He used his position with Alexandra to influence appointments and strategy in ways that would prove disastrous. The mechanism of his meddling was always indirect but terribly effective. Someone seeking appointment or favourable decision would approach Rasputin, often bearing gifts or money. Rasputin would mention the matter to Alexandra during one of his visits or in a telegram. Alexandra would write to Nicholas, framing the recommendation as coming from our friend's divine insight. Nicholas, exhausted by the impossible demands of military command and domestic governance, would often acquiesce to keep peace with his wife. The appointments made through this process were catastrophically bad. Men rose to positions of power not because of competence, but because they had flattered Rasputin or paid bribes. Boris Sturmer, appointed Prime Minister in February 1916 largely because Rasputin supported him, was an elderly reactionary whose German surname alone would have disqualified him from leadership during a war against Germany had rational considerations prevailed. He proved utterly inadequate to the demands of wartime governance. Alexander Protopopov, appointed Minister of Internal Affairs in September 1916, was perhaps the worst of Rasputin's promoted men. Protopopov was mentally unstable. He claimed to have conversations with Rasputin's ghost and to receive instructions from icons. He was also probably syphilitic, his judgment impaired by advancing disease. Yet Rasputin recommended him, Alexandra insisted upon him, and Nicholas appointed him to control internal security during the empire's greatest crisis. The result was predictable: incompetent repression that failed to stop revolutionary organising while alienating potential supporters of the regime. Military appointments followed the same pattern. Capable generals who showed insufficient deference to Rasputin or who opposed his recommended strategies found themselves removed from command. Mediocrities who cultivated our friend's favour received promotions beyond their abilities. The army's effectiveness, already strained by inadequate supplies and horrific casualties, suffered further from this injection of favouritism and incompetence into command decisions. Rasputin's actual understanding of military strategy was non-existent. He was an illiterate peasant with no education in warfare, no comprehension of modern military operations, no knowledge of logistics or tactics. Yet he would have visions or receive divine instructions, or claim to, and these would be transmitted through Alexandra to Nicholas as guidance for the conduct of the war. Sometimes the advice was merely irrelevant. Often it was actively harmful. In September 1915, Rasputin allegedly advised against a particular offensive that Alexandra dutifully transmitted to Nicholas. Whether the offensive would have succeeded or failed is impossible to know. but the fact that military strategy was being influenced by a peasant mystic's claimed visions was corrosive to military morale and effectiveness. Officers knew that Rasputin had influence. They knew that careers could be destroyed by falling afoul of our friend. This knowledge undermined the military hierarchy and replaced meritocracy with corrupt patronage at precisely the moment when Russia needed its military functioning at peak efficiency. The political meddling was even more damaging than the military interference. The Russian government during wartime required stability, competence, and at least minimal coordination between various ministries. Instead, Rasputin's influence created the ministerial leapfrog, the rapid succession of appointments and dismissals that left the government paralysed. Between September 1915 and December 1916, Russia had 4 different prime ministers, 5 ministers of internal affairs, 3 foreign ministers, 3 war ministers, and 4 ministers of agriculture. Each change disrupted ongoing work, broke institutional relationships, and signalled to everyone that competence mattered less than connections to Rasputin. The government lost all coherence just as it faced challenges that would have strained even the most capable administration. The Duma, that weak parliament created by the October Manifesto, watched this chaos with mounting alarm and fury. The Duma had generally supported the war effort, had voted for military appropriations, had tried to help organise civilian contributions to the war. But by 1916, Duma deputies from across the political spectrum, from conservatives to moderate socialists, recognised that Rasputin's influence was destroying Russia's ability to wage war effectively. In November 1916, Pavel Milyukov, leader of the Cadet, Constitutional Democrat Party, and a respected historian, delivered a devastating speech in the Duma. He detailed the government's failures, the incompetence of recent appointments, the disaster of current policies. After each example, he asked rhetorically whether this was stupidity or treason. The speech did not mention Rasputin by name. Censorship made that impossible, but everyone understood who was being implicated. The dark forces controlling policy, the German-sounding names of incompetent ministers, the mysterious influence leading to catastrophic decisions, all pointed clearly to Rasputin, and through him to the Tsarina. The speech circulated throughout Russia in illegal copies, reaching even the trenches where soldiers read it and understood that their suffering was not merely the fortune of war, but the result of corruption and incompetence at the highest levels. The effect was devastating to morale and to what remained of respect for the imperial government. Rasputin himself seemed to revel in his power, even as he contributed to the disasters he had prophesied. He continued his nightly rounds of restaurants and bathhouses, drinking heavily, boasting of his influence, making crude jokes about his relationship with the imperial family. The Okraina reports from this period describe a man drunk on power as much as on vodka. Unable to exercise even minimal discretion, he claimed openly that he appointed ministers, that he directed military strategy, that the Tsarina relied completely on his counsel. Whether these claims were accurate or exaggerated, the fact that he made them publicly was itself destructive. Every boast, every drunken revelation, every crude joke about the imperial family fed the growing conviction that Russia was being ruled not by competent leaders, but by a corrupt and debauched peasant mystic who had somehow hypnotized the empress. The darkest rumours circulated without restraint beyond official censorship, that Rasputin was the Tsarina's lover, that Alexei was not Nicholas's son but Rasputin's, that the holy man led a sect of women in sexual rituals at the palace, that he was a German spy working to engineer Russia's defeat. None of these rumours were true, but their widespread belief was itself a fact of devastating political importance. Whether or not Rasputin was actually doing all that he was accused of mattered less than the reality that millions of Russians believed he was. The symbolic damage was as destructive as the actual incompetent appointments. The monarchy's legitimacy rested on the aura of sacred authority, on the belief that the Tsar ruled by divine right and led the nation with wisdom inherited through dynasty. When a drunken peasant could publicly boast of controlling the throne, when ministers were appointed based on his favour rather than merit, when the empress was rumoured to be under his sexual thrall, all of this destroyed the mystique that had sustained autocracy for centuries. By the winter of 1916, Russia was approaching complete breakdown. The military had suffered millions of casualties for gains that could not be sustained. The economy was collapsing under impossible strain. The cities were starving while peasants hoarded grain they could not transport to markets. The government was paralysed by rapid turnover and incompetent leadership. Revolutionary organisations, suppressed but not destroyed, were rebuilding their networks and preparing for opportunity. And at the centre of it all, like a dark spider in a web, sat Grigori Rasputin, the wanderer from Siberia who had gained impossible power and used it with catastrophic incompetence. He had warned that war would destroy Russia, and he had been right, but his own meddling had accelerated the destruction he prophesied. He had claimed to serve the dynasty, yet his influence was among the forces ensuring its collapse. The war had created conditions where Rasputin's influence could expand beyond the confined circle of the imperial family's private spiritual life to encompass governance of a vast empire at war. That expansion, facilitated by Alexandra's absolute faith and Nicholas's weak acquiescence, transformed what had been merely scandalous into something genuinely catastrophic. The wanderer had meddled in affairs he could not understand, wielding power he was not competent to exercise, and Russia was paying the price in blood and approaching revolution. Chapter 8. The Scandals Multiply. By the year 1916, Grigori Rasputin had become more than a controversial figure at court. He had transformed into a national scandal that threatened the very foundations of imperial legitimacy. The whispers that had begun in aristocratic drawing rooms now echoed through workers' taverns, peasant villages, and soldiers' trenches. The man who had entered Petersburg as an obscure holy pilgrim now dominated Russia's collective imagination as a symbol of everything corrupt and diseased in the dying regime. The scandals surrounding Rasputin were no longer merely matters of personal behaviour or questionable appointments. They had metastasized into a comprehensive indictment of the autocracy itself. Each new story, each documented incident, each rumour, whether true or fabricated, added another stone to the edifice of public outrage that was being constructed around the imperial family's tolerance of this extraordinary figure. The Okhrana surveillance reports from 1916 paint a portrait of systematic debauchery conducted with apparent disregard for consequences. The agents assigned to follow Rasputin, ostensibly for his protection but actually to document his activities, filed daily reports of behaviour that would have resulted in arrest for any ordinary citizen. Their files grew thick with accounts that blended the sordid with the almost absurd. A typical evening would begin with Rasputin emerging from his apartment on Gorokhovaya Street, often already somewhat intoxicated. He would make his way to one of several restaurants he frequented. The Villa Road was a particular favourite, where he would drink heavily and hold court. The restaurant owners tolerated his presence because of his connections to the palace, even as his behaviour drove away other customers. As the evening progressed and the alcohol took hold, Rasputin would become increasingly loud and unrestrained. He would shout across the restaurant, making crude jokes and sexual propositions to women dining with their husbands or families. The Okhrana reports describe instances of him exposing himself, of forcing kisses on unwilling women, of claiming that intimacy with him carried spiritual benefits because he was a holy man and sin committed with him was somehow purified. On one occasion documented in police files, Rasputin became so drunk and disorderly at a restaurant that other patrons demanded his removal. When police were summoned, he shouted that he could do as he pleased because he was intimate with the Empress. The police, recognizing him and aware of his protected status, withdrew rather than arrest him. But the incident became public knowledge, appearing in newspaper accounts that censors failed to suppress completely. The bathhouses of Petrograd provided another venue for scandal. These establishments, traditional gathering places where Russians of various classes mingled in the steam and heat, should have been refuges from social pretension. But Rasputin's behaviour in bathhouses transgressed even the relaxed standards of these venues. Multiple accounts emerged of him making aggressive sexual advances to women, sometimes claiming that he could see their sins and that sexual contact with him would serve as a form of spiritual cleansing. One particularly detailed account involved a woman from a respectable merchant family who visited a bathhouse with female relatives. According to her testimony, later provided to authorities, Rasputin approached them, engaged them in religious conversation, then began touching them inappropriately while speaking of sin and redemption. When they objected, he reportedly said that physical contact with a man of God could not be sinful, but was rather a path to grace. The women fled and reported the incident, but no action was taken against Rasputin due to his protected status. His apartment on Gorokovaya Street became itself a site of scandal. The building was unremarkable from the outside, a typical middle-class residence in a respectable, if not fashionable, district. But inside Rasputin's rooms, scenes unfolded that fed the darkest rumours about his activities. A constant stream of visitors, predominantly women, would arrive at all hours. Some came seeking spiritual counsel. Others sought his help in obtaining favours, government positions for relatives, resolution of bureaucratic disputes, access to higher circles of power. The question of what occurred during these private audiences became the subject of intense speculation and conflicting testimony. Some women who visited Rasputin later testified that he had assaulted them sexually, using his position and reputation to coerce compliance. They described a pattern of behaviour where spiritual counsel would gradually shift into physical intimacy, with Rasputin claiming that carnal knowledge of a holy man was itself a form of sacrament. Other women, and there were many, defended Rasputin absolutely, insisting that his behaviour was beyond reproach and that any accusations were malicious lies. These defenders, sometimes called Rasputin's little ladies, formed a devoted circle around him. They visited his apartment regularly, attended his religious discussions, and proclaimed publicly that he had healed them or saved them through his prayers and guidance. The truth, as always, was difficult to extract from the conflicting accounts. Undoubtedly, Rasputin engaged in sexual relationships with some of the women who visited him. Whether these relationships were consensual, coerced, or something more complex involving psychological manipulation and genuine belief in his spiritual authority, varied from case to case. What cannot be disputed is that a man claiming to be a holy elder was using that status to gain access to women, and that some of these encounters involved behaviour incompatible with genuine holiness. The most damaging scandal involved allegations about Rasputin's relationship with the imperial family itself. The rumour that he was the Tsarina's lover had been circulating for years, growing more explicit and widespread as time passed. By 1916, the accusation appeared in anonymous pamphlets, in foreign newspapers beyond Russian censorship, and in the whispered conversations of ordinary Russians who had lost faith in their rulers. The evidence for such a relationship was non-existent. Alexandra's personality, her rigid morality, her devotion to Nicholas, the constant surveillance that made privacy nearly impossible, all argued powerfully against any sexual relationship. Moreover, Rasputin's hold over Alexandra derived from something deeper and more dangerous than sexual thrall. He controlled her through her absolute conviction that he was God's instrument for saving her son. Sexual relations would actually have diminished rather than enhanced that spiritual authority. But the absence of evidence did not prevent belief. The relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin was intimate in ways that contemporaries found deeply troubling, even if not sexual. She confided in him completely. She sought his counsel on matters both personal and political. She defended him against all criticism with a fervour that suggested more than mere respect for a spiritual advisor. The emotional dependency, visible to all who observed them together, fed speculation that physical intimacy must also be occurring. Even more explosive were rumours regarding Rasputin and the Grand Duchesses, the 4 daughters of Nicholas and Alexandra. These young women, raised in the protective isolation of Tsarskoye Selo, were devoted to their parents and to our friend, whom they saw as their brother's saviour. They wrote letters to Rasputin, addressing him with affectionate diminutives, thanking him for his prayers. When these letters were stolen and published by Rasputin's enemies, they were interpreted as evidence of improper relationships. The letters themselves, examined objectively, contained nothing explicitly sexual. They were effusive and emotionally open in the manner of young women raised in a hothouse atmosphere of religious devotion and family intimacy. But the very existence of such letters between imperial princesses and a peasant mystic was shocking, and the interpretations placed upon them by Rasputin's enemies were deliberately salacious. Particular scandal attached to allegations about Rasputin and Anna Virubova, the Tsarina's closest friend and the primary facilitator of her relationship with the holy man. Virubova, a plump and rather foolish woman of limited intelligence but complete devotion to Alexandra, had become as dependent on Rasputin as the Tsarina herself. She visited him frequently, defended him unconditionally, and served as messenger between him and the imperial family. Rumours circulated that Virabova was Rasputin's lover, that she participated in his alleged sex rituals, that the three of them, Rasputin, Alexandra and Virabova, engaged in some form of mystical sexual practices. A famous incident occurred when Virabova was injured in a train accident in 1915. Rasputin was summoned and reportedly told her, "Anushka, open your eyes." She did, and survived injuries that doctors had believed fatal. Was this genuine miracle or fortunate timing? The incident reinforced believers' faith, but also fed rumours about the unholy nature of his power. After the revolution, when Virabova was imprisoned and interrogated, she was subjected to medical examination to determine whether she was a virgin. The examination concluded that she was, which seemed to disprove rumours of sexual relationship with Rasputin. But the very fact that such an examination was conducted, that the new revolutionary government considered it necessary to determine the sexual history of the former Tsarina's companion, demonstrates how completely the scandals had poisoned perceptions of the old regime. The political scandals were as damaging as the sexual ones. By 1916, it was widely known that Rasputin influenced government appointments, that ministers sought his favour, that access to power could be purchased through gifts or payments to the holy man. The corruption was blatant and systematic, conducted without meaningful attempt at concealment. Specific incidents accumulated into a damning record. A certain banker, seeking favourable government decision on a business matter, gave Rasputin a substantial sum. Rasputin mentioned the matter to Alexandra. The favourable decision was granted. A noble seeking a government appointment brought expensive gifts to Rasputin's apartment. The appointment followed. An industrialist wanting a military contract provided money. The contract was awarded. None of this involved official bribery in the traditional sense. Rasputin held no government position and could not directly grant favours. But his influence over Alexandra, and through her over Nicholas, created a shadow system where power could be purchased through the holy man's intervention. The system was corrupt in effect, even if not in legal form. Perhaps most damaging were the whispers that Rasputin was a German spy, working to engineer Russia's defeat. This accusation seems to have been false. No evidence has ever emerged proving Rasputin was in contact with German intelligence or working toward their victory. His opposition to the war appeared genuine, stemming from mystical conviction and peasant practicality rather than foreign loyalty. Yet the accusation gained credence because it explained otherwise inexplicable behaviour. How else to understand the appointment of incompetent ministers during wartime? How else to interpret Rasputin's opposition to competent generals? How else to explain advice that seemed calculated to damage Russia's war effort? The spy theory provided a coherent narrative that made sense of madness. The Tsarina's German birth provided fodder for these suspicions. She had been born in Germany. She spoke German fluently. Her letters to Nicholas often mixed Russian, English and German. During a war against Germany, these facts became sinister in popular imagination. The leap from "the Tsarina is German" to "the Tsarina is a German spy" to "the Tsarina and her advisor Rasputin are working for German victory" followed a logic fueled by military disaster and desperate need to explain the unexplainable. Anonymous pamphlets appeared on Petrograd streets, vicious in their accusations and sometimes pornographic in their imagery. One portrayed Alexandra and Rasputin in sexual congress, while German generals laughed. Another depicted Rasputin as a demon with the imperial family as his puppets. These pamphlets were illegal, their authors risked severe punishment, yet they circulated widely because they expressed what many Russians had come to believe. The Orthodox Church, which should have been Rasputin's natural defender, had largely turned against him. Most hierarchs recognized him as a heretic at best, a charlatan at worst. But the Church was subordinate to the state, and the state was controlled by a Tsarina who viewed Rasputin as a saint. Bishops who spoke against him found themselves transferred to remote dioceses. Parish priests who preached against his influence were silenced. One brave priest delivered a sermon in 1916 that circulated in written form throughout the capital. He spoke of false prophets and wolves in sheep's clothing, of how the devil could appear in the guise of holiness. He never mentioned Rasputin by name, but everyone understood who he meant. Within days, the priest was arrested for causing unrest and exiled to Siberia. The incident demonstrated that criticizing Rasputin had become as dangerous as criticizing the Tsar himself, and far more dangerous than merely calling for political reform. The multiplying scandals created a situation where the imperial family's legitimacy was being destroyed not through revolutionary action, but through their own association with Rasputin. Every new incident, every fresh scandal, every public display of the holy man's debauchery or political corruption damaged the throne's sacred aura. The mystique of autocracy, that belief in the Tsar as father to his people and God's anointed ruler, could not survive the reality of power exercised by a drunken peasant who boasted of his influence while propositioning women in restaurants. Military morale suffered catastrophically. Soldiers in the trenches, dying in their thousands for lack of ammunition and competent leadership, heard stories of Rasputin's influence and drew obvious conclusions. They were sacrificing their lives while power was exercised by a corrupt mystic, more interested in wine and women than in military victory. The connection between Rasputin's interference in military appointments and their own suffering on the front was clear enough that even poorly educated peasant soldiers could grasp it. Officers, particularly those from aristocratic families, experienced a crisis of loyalty. They had been raised to believe in service to the Tsar as a sacred duty. But how could one serve when the Tsar was under the influence of such a figure? How could one die for a dynasty that tolerated, embraced, a man like Rasputin? Some officers resolved this dilemma by distinguishing between loyalty to Russia and loyalty to the current occupants of the throne. This distinction would prove crucial in the revolution to come, when military units would refuse to defend the Tsar because they no longer believed he embodied Russia's true interests. The final months of 1916 saw scandal piled upon scandal until the accumulated weight threatened complete collapse. Rasputin's behaviour became, if anything, more outrageous, as if he sensed his time was running out and determined to extract maximum enjoyment from his position while it lasted. Or perhaps he had simply lost any capacity for self-restraint, drunk on power and alcohol in equal measure, unable to recognise the disaster his behaviour was creating. In November 1916, Milyukov's speech in the Duma brought everything into the open. Though Rasputin's name was not spoken due to censorship, the entire speech was about him and the dark forces he represented. The speech's circulation throughout Russia meant that even the most remote village heard about the scandals that had previously been confined to the capital. The imperial family's tolerance of Rasputin became known to all, and known not as mysterious political manoeuvring but as simple fact that demanded explanation. No adequate explanation could be offered because the truth, that Rasputin could stop the heirs bleeding when doctors could not, remained a closely guarded secret. Without that explanation, his influence appeared as either massive corruption or evidence that the Tsarina was his lover or both. The secrecy that was meant to protect the dynasty instead created a vacuum filled by the darkest possible interpretations. By December 1916, even those most loyal to the throne recognized that something must be done. Rasputin had become a liability so devastating that his continued presence endangered the monarchy's survival. The scandals had multiplied beyond any possibility of denial or explanation. Every day brought new outrages, new evidence of corruption or debauchery, new reasons for the Russian people to lose faith in their rulers. The question was no longer whether Rasputin should be removed, but who would act and how? Behind closed doors, in whispered conversations, various conspiracies began to form. The scandals had created the necessity for action. Now, all that remained was for someone to summon the courage, or recklessness, to act upon that necessity, to remove the holy devil whose scandals had multiplied beyond endurance, whose presence had become incompatible with the dynasty's survival. The winter deepened, the scandals multiplied, and in the shadows those who would become his murderers were gathering, preparing to end the life of the man who seemed to have survived everything else. Scandal, opposition, even previous attempts on his life. They believed that killing Rasputin would save Russia. They would discover, too late, that the corruption he represented ran far deeper than one man's life or death could address. Chapter 9. The gathering storm of hatred. The hatred that had been building around Rasputin for years reached critical mass in the autumn of 1916. It was no longer merely the whispered disapproval of courtiers or the outrage of religious hierarchs. It had become a force that united people across Russia's normally unbridgeable social and political divides. Aristocrats and revolutionaries, generals and civilians. Conservatives and liberals all found common cause in their detestation of the peasant mystic, who held inexplicable power over the throne. The Duma provided the most public forum for this hatred, though its expression there had to be coded and indirect due to censorship laws that made direct criticism of the imperial family dangerous. Nevertheless, deputies from across the political spectrum found ways to make their opposition clear. The Constitutional Democrats, led by Milyukov, were most explicit. The speech he delivered in November 1916 became legendary, not for what it said directly, but for what it implied. Milyukov's technique was to describe each government failure, each incompetent appointment, each disastrous policy decision, and then ask the rhetorical question, is this stupidity or treason? The repetition of this question, building through example after example, created a devastating indictment. The answer, he implied, was clear. Such consistent disaster could not be mere stupidity. Someone, somewhere, must be deliberately working to destroy Russia from within. Though Rasputin was never named in the official version of the speech, everyone understood who Milyukov meant when he spoke of dark forces and mysterious influences leading to catastrophic decisions. The speech was officially banned from publication, but copies circulated throughout Russia by the thousands. Soldiers in trenches read it. Factory workers discussed it in their barracks. Even peasants in remote villages heard garbled versions. The effect was to place before the entire nation the accusation that the government, and by extension the imperial family, was either treasonously incompetent or actively working for Russia's defeat. The conservative deputies, who might have been expected to defend the throne, joined in the criticism with barely less fervour. Vladimir Purishkevich, a monarchist deputy known for his extreme right-wing views, delivered his own speech shortly after Milyukov's. Purishkevich's loyalty to the principle of autocracy was absolute, but he recognised that Rasputin's influence was destroying the very institution he sought to preserve. He spoke of the need to save the monarchy from those who were destroying it from within, of dark forces that must be swept away if Russia was to be saved. The irony was that Purishkevich's speech, given on December 19, 1916, came mere days before he would himself participate in the conspiracy to murder Rasputin. He was not merely talking about the need for action. He was preparing to act, using the forum of the Duma to lay the psychological groundwork for assassination by establishing that Rasputin's removal was necessary for Russia's survival. Beyond the Duma, hatred for Rasputin united groups that agreed on nothing else. The revolutionary parties, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, all saw him as a useful propaganda tool. They could point to Rasputin as perfect evidence that the autocracy was corrupt, decadent, and doomed. Revolutionary pamphlets depicted him as the logical endpoint of a system that concentrated power in unaccountable hands. If such a man could dominate the throne, they argued, the entire system must be swept away and replaced. The liberals and moderate reformers, who still hoped to save Russia through constitutional evolution rather than revolution, saw Rasputin as the single greatest obstacle to peaceful reform. If only he could be removed, if only the imperial family could be freed from his influence, then perhaps Nicholas might be convinced to work with the Duma to implement reforms to transform Russia into a constitutional monarchy. This belief was probably naive. The problems ran far deeper than one man, but it motivated many who would otherwise never have contemplated violence against anyone associated with the throne. The military establishment's hatred was particularly bitter and dangerous. Officers who had spent careers serving the throne with loyalty and honour watched in impotent rage as Rasputin interfered in appointments and strategy. They saw competent commanders removed to make way for mediocrities who had curried the holy man's favour. They watched as military decisions were influenced by Rasputin's visions and prophecies rather than by strategic analysis, and they connected these interferences directly to the disasters on the front, to the hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers, to Russia's continued defeats. General Alexei Brusilov, who had led the one successful Russian offensive of 1916, privately expressed the view that Rasputin was doing more damage to Russia than German armies. Other generals were less discreet. General Mikhail Alexeyev, Chief of Staff, attempted repeatedly to convince Nicholas that Rasputin must be removed. These entreaties were dismissed, usually after Alexandra convinced Nicholas that the generals were simply jealous of our friend's spiritual insights. The most dangerous hatred came from within the extended Romanov family itself. Grand dukes and duchesses, princes and princesses who had served the dynasty loyally for generations recognized that Rasputin was destroying the monarchy from within. They could see what Nicholas and Alexandra refused to see, that the peasant mystic's influence was eroding the throne's legitimacy faster than any revolutionary party could manage. Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, the Tsar's cousin and former commander-in-chief before Nicholas took personal command of the armies, was said to have once threatened to hang Rasputin if he ever appeared at military headquarters. The threat was probably meant literally. The Grand Duke, a towering figure respected by the military, understood that Rasputin's interference in military affairs was contributing directly to Russian defeats. His hatred was the cold, deadly hatred of a professional soldier watching an incompetent amateur destroy his life's work. The Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, Nicholas's mother, used every opportunity to try to convince her son to banish Rasputin. She was Alexandra's natural rival, the previous empress versus the current one, mother-in-law versus daughter-in-law. But her opposition to Rasputin was not merely personal. She had lived through her husband Alexander III's reign, had seen how autocracy could be maintained through strength and careful management. She recognized that Rasputin's presence made such management impossible, that his scandals were destroying the mystique that legitimized imperial power. Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, Alexandra's own sister, attempted intervention from a position of moral authority that was unassailable. Elizabeth had become a nun after her husband's assassination, had founded a religious order, had dedicated herself to charity and spiritual life. Her holiness was genuine in ways that Rasputin's never was. When she begged Alexandra to recognize that Rasputin was not a true holy man, her sister dismissed her with cold finality. Elizabeth left the meeting in tears, recognizing that Alexandra was lost to reason. Even the Tsar's siblings expressed alarm. Grand Duke Mikhail, Nicholas's younger brother and potential heir if something happened to Alexei, urged action against Rasputin. Grand Duchess Zania, Nicholas's sister, joined her mother in pleading with him to save the dynasty by removing the holy man. All these interventions failed, breaking against Alexandra's unshakable faith and Nicholas's weak inability to deny his wife. The hatred manifested in tangible threats. Rasputin received numerous death threats, delivered through mail or whispered by strangers who passed him on the street. The Okhrana reported at least 3 serious assassination attempts before the successful one in December 1916. A peasant woman, possibly deranged or possibly an agent of Rasputin's enemies, had tried to knife him in his home village of Pokrovskoye in 1914, inflicting a severe wound that nearly killed him. He had been hospitalized for months, and even Alexandra's desperate telegrams could not summon him to help Alexei during that period. The various factions plotting against Rasputin in late 1916 were aware of each other in vague outline but didn't coordinate. Conservative nobles discussed his removal in their clubs. Revolutionary cells debated whether assassinating him would help or hurt their cause. Some argued it would eliminate a useful propaganda symbol. Others claimed his death might destabilize the regime in ways that would advance revolution. Military officers spoke in guarded terms about the necessity of action. Each group believed they might need to act, but each hesitated, knowing that killing someone so close to the imperial family would be seen as an attack on the throne itself. The general public's hatred was perhaps most dangerous because it was most general and least focused. Workers in Petrograd's factories sang crude songs about Rasputin and the Tsarina, songs so obscene that mere repetition would have resulted in arrest. Peasants in villages spoke of how the German woman had taken a peasant lover, and together they were betraying Russia. Soldiers at the front told each other that they were dying so that Rasputin could drink wine and seduce women in Petrograd restaurants. This popular hatred was building toward revolutionary explosion, though few recognized it at the time. The people had lost faith not merely in particular policies or ministers, but in the system itself. When the autocracy could be dominated by such a figure, when power flowed through such corrupt channels, when scandal piled upon scandal without consequence, then the entire system was revealed as bankrupt and deserving of destruction. The Church's opposition, muted though it was by subordination to state authority, added moral weight to the hatred. Parish priests knew Rasputin was a heretic and probable fraud. They heard confessions from women he had allegedly assaulted. They watched as genuine spirituality was discredited by association with his debauchery, but they were largely powerless to act, bound by the hierarchy's unwillingness to confront the throne directly. Some individual clerics attempted intervention. Father Georgy Shevelsky, military chaplain general, tried to convince Nicholas that Rasputin was destroying the church's moral authority. Bishop Hermogen, before his exile, had physically attacked Rasputin in an attempt to drive him from Petersburg. These individual actions were brave but ultimately futile against Alexandra's protection. Foreign observers watched the situation with amazement and growing alarm. The French and British ambassadors, whose countries were allied with Russia in the war against Germany, recognized that Rasputin's influence was damaging Russia's war effort. They filed reports to their governments describing the chaos in Russian governance and the mysterious peasant who seemed to be at its center. Some foreign intelligence services apparently considered assassinating Rasputin themselves, viewing him as more dangerous to the Allied war effort than many German generals. The American ambassador, David Francis, later described the atmosphere in Petrograd in late 1916 as approaching insanity. Everyone spoke of Rasputin. Everyone had theories about his power. Everyone agreed something must be done. But who would act? And would acting solve the problem or merely expose deeper rot that Rasputin's presence had concealed? The hatred had become a force unto itself, a storm gathering strength, seeking outlet. It united monarchists who wanted to save the throne and revolutionaries who wanted to destroy it. It brought together conservative generals and liberal politicians, pious believers and cynical atheists. Rasputin had achieved the impossible. He had united Russia, but in hatred of himself and by extension of the system that had elevated him. By early December 1916, the storm was ready to break. Various plots were reaching fruition simultaneously, uncoordinated but parallel. Someone would act soon. The tension had become unbearable, the necessity obvious. The only questions were who would strike first and whether Rasputin's removal could come in time to save the dynasty he had helped to destroy. In the event, the conspiracy that succeeded came from an unexpected quarter, not from revolutionary plotters or military professionals, but from a group of aristocratic amateurs driven by desperate conviction that killing Rasputin represented Russia's last hope. They believed that assassination would save the monarchy. They would discover, in the blood-soaked months that followed, that they had acted too late and that the rot went far deeper than one man's life or death could address. The storm of hatred was about to break in violence, murder, and ultimately in revolution that would sweep away not merely Rasputin but the entire world he represented. The gathering storm would become a hurricane that would destroy 300 years of dynasty and reshape Russia in blood and iron. Chapter 10. The conspirators gather in the elegant townhouses and aristocratic salons of Petrograd. As winter settled over the capital in December 1916, conversations turned with increasing frequency to a question that seemed to admit only one answer. Who would rid Russia of Rasputin? The question was not whether action was necessary, that had been settled in the minds of many, but rather who possessed the courage, the access, and the willingness to commit an act that would be simultaneously murder and, in the conspirators' minds, patriotic salvation. The conspiracy that would ultimately succeed began to take shape in November 1916, brought together by a peculiar combination of personalities united by desperation and convinced of their righteous purpose. At its center stood Prince Felix Yusupov, a figure whose very existence seemed to embody the contradictions and decadence of late Imperial Russia. Felix Felixovich Yusupov was 29 years old in 1916, heir to one of the most fabulous fortunes in Russia. The Yusupov family wealth exceeded even that of the Romanovs. Their estates stretched across vast territories. Their palaces in Petersburg and Moscow contained art collections rivaling those of museums. Their name carried prestige accumulated over centuries. Felix had been raised in luxury that bordered on the absurd. Private theatres, collections of jewels and paintings, servants numbering in the hundreds. Yet despite this privilege, or perhaps because of it, Felix had developed into a strange and troubled figure. He had been educated at Oxford, where he had scandalized English society with his behaviour. He was beautiful in an almost feminine way. Delicate features, large eyes, graceful movements that suggested androgyny. There were persistent rumours about his sexuality, suggestions of affairs with men as well as women, stories of cross-dressing and appearances in Petrograd's more decadent nightclubs disguised as a woman. In 1914's dinner, Felix had married Princess Irina Alexandrovna, niece of Tsar Nicholas, a match that connected him directly to the imperial family. The marriage appeared happy enough, though rumours persisted about Felix's continued involvement in Petersburg's underground sexual culture. By 1916, he had become convinced that Rasputin was destroying Russia and that he, Felix Yusupov, was destined to save the nation by eliminating the holy man. The psychology behind this conviction was complex. Felix seems to have been simultaneously repelled by and fascinated with Rasputin. He later claimed to have visited the holy man several times in late 1916, ostensibly seeking spiritual counsel, but actually preparing the ground for assassination. During these visits, according to Felix's own accounts, Rasputin attempted to exert his hypnotic influence, tried to convert Felix to his teachings, and possibly made sexual advances. Whether these accounts were accurate or embellished to justify the murder that followed is impossible to determine with certainty. What seems clear is that Felix had developed an obsession with Rasputin that went beyond political necessity. He told friends that he felt called by destiny to rid Russia of this evil. He spoke of himself as an instrument of divine justice, chosen to perform a sacred duty. The grandiosity of this self-conception should have warned his co-conspirators that they were dealing with someone whose grip on reality was not entirely firm. The second major conspirator was Vladimir Purishkevich, the monarchist Duma deputy whose speech on December 19th had openly called for Rasputin's removal. Purishkevich was in many ways Felix's opposite, middle-aged, from a family of modest nobility, conservative to the point of reaction, a fervent believer in autocracy and Orthodox Christianity. He was also genuinely patriotic in a way that Felix, with his cosmopolitan education and European lifestyle, was not. Purishkevich had founded the Union of the Russian People, an extreme right-wing organisation that advocated militant nationalism and often organised pogroms against Jews. His politics were repellent to modern sensibilities, but his concern for Russia's fate during the war was genuine. He had served at the front as a volunteer, organising medical trains for wounded soldiers. He had witnessed the carnage and understood that Russia was losing the war partly due to the chaos Rasputin's influence had created in government. For Purishkevich, killing Rasputin was a patriotic duty, necessary to save both the monarchy and Russia itself. He believed absolutely in the Tsar's divine right to rule, but he also believed that the Tsar was being led astray by dark forces that must be eliminated. The contradiction, that he was plotting to kill someone under the Tsar's protection, apparently did not trouble him. In his mind, he was serving the true interests of autocracy, even while defying its current embodiment. The third major conspirator was Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, cousin to Tsar Nicholas, and at 25 one of the most eligible bachelors in Russia. Dmitry was an orphan. His mother had died shortly after his birth, his father had been exiled for scandalous behaviour, and he had been raised largely by Nicholas and Alexandra, who had treated him as a son. His participation in a plot to kill someone his foster parents valued above almost anyone else represented a profound betrayal that must have cost him considerable anguish. Yet Dmitry had come to believe that removing Rasputin was necessary. He had witnessed the holy man's behaviour at court, had seen the influence he exercised over Alexandra, had recognised that the dynasty he loved was being destroyed by its association with this figure. As a Grand Duke and army officer, he also understood that Russia was losing the war and that Rasputin's interference in military appointments was contributing to disaster. Dmitry's participation was crucial for several reasons. His status as a Grand Duke provided a degree of legitimacy to the conspiracy. This was not merely commoners plotting against someone close to the throne, but a member of the imperial family itself recognising necessity. His military rank gave him access to resources and cover for unusual movements. And his personal relationship with Nicholas and Alexandra meant that his involvement would make the murder particularly devastating to them emotionally. The conspiracy included other, more peripheral figures. Dr. Stanislaus Lazovert, an army physician, was recruited to provide poison and medical expertise. Lieutenant Sergei Sukhotin, an officer and friend of Dmitry, apparently knew of the plot, though his exact role remains unclear. Some accounts mention additional participants whose identities have been lost or confused in later retellings. The planning began in earnest in late November or early December. the conspirators met in secret, usually at Felix's Moika palace, discussing methods and timing. Their challenge was substantial. Rasputin was under constant surveillance by the Okhrana, ostensibly for his protection. He had survived at least one serious assassination attempt. He was reportedly suspicious of danger, often changing his plans at the last moment, sometimes carrying protective talismans. More fundamentally, the conspirators were amateurs. None of them were professional assassins or experienced in killing. Felix was a wealthy dilettante. Purishkevich was a politician. Dmitri was an army officer, but had never seen combat. They were essentially aristocratic murderers, planning to kill a man they had demonized in their minds until he seemed less human than symbol. Their method reflected this amateur status. Rather than a straightforward shooting or stabbing, they developed an elaborate plan involving poison, deception, and theatrical staging. Felix would lure Rasputin to the Moika palace by suggesting that his wife Irina, whom Rasputin had allegedly expressed interest in meeting, would be there. Once Rasputin was in the palace, he would be given wine and cakes laced with cyanide. The poison would kill him, and his body would be disposed of in a way that made the death appear accidental, or at least obscured the murderers' identities. The plan had numerous weaknesses that should have been obvious. It relied on Rasputin accepting an invitation from Felix despite their limited acquaintance. It assumed the poison would work quickly and cleanly. It required disposing of a body in winter, in a city where the Okhrana would immediately begin searching for a missing person of Rasputin's importance. The plan's theatrical quality, the poisoned cakes, the careful staging, suggested conspirators more influenced by romantic literature than by practical understanding of murder. Nevertheless, they proceeded. Dr. Lazovert obtained cyanide, reportedly enough to kill several men. The poison was prepared in crystalline form to be added to wine and baked into cakes. Felix prepared the murder room in his palace basement, a chamber he decorated to appear comfortable and inviting, with a fire burning, food and wine laid out, even a gramophone playing music to create the illusion of a party happening upstairs. The conspirators rehearsed their roles. Felix would be the host, engaging Rasputin in conversation, encouraging him to eat and drink the poisoned items. The others would wait upstairs, pretending to be party guests whose noise would explain the music and suggest that Princess Irina was present. Once Rasputin consumed enough poison and died, they would dispose of the body in the Neva River, where winter ice would hopefully conceal it until spring. The date was set for the night of December 29, 1916. Felix would send a message to Rasputin extending the invitation to meet Princess Irina. The conspirators would gather at the Moika palace. The murder would proceed. Russia would be saved. In their planning, the conspirators apparently gave little thought to the possibility of failure. They were convinced of the righteousness of their cause and the necessity of their action. Rasputin was evil. This they knew with the certainty of men who had convinced themselves that killing was not merely justified, but sacred duty. They saw themselves as heroes, as saviors of Russia, as instruments of divine justice. What they failed to understand was that Rasputin was not the cause of Russia's problems, but a symptom. The rot in the imperial system ran far deeper than one man's influence. The autocracy's inability to modernize, the empire's fundamental weaknesses exposed by modern total war, the gulf between rulers and ruled that had grown unbridgeable, none of these would be addressed by murder. But the conspirators, convinced of their insight and desperate for action that would provide the illusion of solution, proceeded toward their appointment with violence. In the days leading up to December 29th, the conspirators made their final preparations. Felix apparently visited Rasputin several times, establishing rapport and laying groundwork for the invitation. Purishkevich ensured he had alibis for his presence in Petrograd, rather than at the front. Dmitri arranged his military duties to ensure availability. Dr. Lazovert checked and rechecked the poison, confirming it was sufficient to kill quickly. Rasputin himself seems to have had some premonition of danger. Several accounts suggest he was troubled in the days before his murder, speaking of threats and expressing fear. Yet when Felix's invitation arrived, he apparently accepted, drawn by the promise of meeting Princess Irina and perhaps by the curiosity that seemed to drive him toward risky situations. The stage was set. The conspirators were gathered. The victim had accepted the invitation. On the night of December 29, 1916, in a basement room of the Moika Palace, the conspiracy would become action, the planning would become murder, and Russia would discover whether killing Rasputin could save an empire already far advanced in the process of dying. The conspirators believed they were saving Russia. They would learn, in the revolutionary chaos that followed, that they had merely provided the dynasty's death rattle with an overture of murder. But on that December night, as they gathered in the palace and prepared poison and rehearsed their roles, they were still capable of believing that one act of violence could change history, that killing the mad monk would somehow restore sanity to a world gone mad with war and suffering and the accumulated failures of 3 centuries of autocratic rule. Chapter 11. The Night of Poison and Bullets, December 29, 1916. The winter night descended upon Petrograd with the bitter cold that turns breath to ice and makes the city's frozen canals groan with the contraction of ice already 2 feet thick. In the elegant Moika Palace, home to the Yusupov family for generations, the conspirators gathered in rooms far from the servants' quarters, speaking in low voices as they made their final preparations for murder. Felix Yusupov moved through the palace with nervous energy, checking and rechecking arrangements. The basement room had been prepared with theatrical attention to detail, a room that appeared comfortable and inviting, with Persian carpets, carved furniture, and a fire burning in the granite hearth. On a table sat plates of cakes and biscuits, wine glasses, several bottles of Madeira wine. All of it, the food and drink, had been carefully poisoned with cyanide provided by Dr. Lazovert. The doctor himself was present, though he would later claim his nerve nearly failed. He had administered the poison himself, crushing the crystals and mixing them into the wine, baking them into the cakes. The amount he used was supposedly sufficient to kill several men almost instantly. Medical texts of the time suggested that cyanide in such quantities would stop the heart within minutes, perhaps causing some convulsions but resulting in rapid death. Upstairs, Perishkovich, Grand Duke Dmitri, and the other conspirators waited, occasionally moving furniture or playing a few notes on the gramophone to create the illusion of a party in progress. This deception was necessary to the plan. Rasputin had been told that Princess Irina was hosting a small gathering upstairs and would meet with him after the other guests departed. In reality, Irina was far from Petrograd, staying at an estate in the Crimea, entirely ignorant of the use being made of her name. Near midnight, Felix departed the palace in his automobile to collect Rasputin from the apartment on Gorokhovaya Street. The drive through the frozen streets took him past the dark bulk of the Admiralty, across bridges where the Neva's ice gleamed in moonlight, through districts where only occasional windows showed light. Petrograd at night in winter was a city of shadows and cold, where few ventured out unnecessarily and where an automobile's passage drew little attention. Rasputin was waiting, dressed in his better clothing, an embroidered peasant blouse, velvet trousers, high boots. He had apparently taken some care with his appearance for this meeting with Princess Irina. His mood, according to Felix's later account, seemed cheerful, but also somehow fatalistic, as if he sensed the significance of the night, even if he could not identify the specific danger. During the automobile ride back to the Moika Palace, Felix and Rasputin conversed. Felix later claimed that Rasputin spoke of premonitions, of feeling that his time was short, of enemies gathering. Whether this conversation actually occurred or was Felix's later embellishment is impossible to determine. What is certain is that Rasputin entered the palace willingly, following Felix down to the basement room where death waited in poisoned cakes and wine. The basement chamber was warm from the fire, inviting after the bitter cold outside. Felix played the host, encouraging Rasputin to sit, offering food and wine. From upstairs came the sounds of the supposed party, furniture moving, occasional music from the gramophone, voices that were actually the conspirators creating illusion. Rasputin initially refused the food and wine. This hesitation, whether from suspicion or simple lack of appetite, must have terrified Felix, whose entire plan depended on the holy man consuming the poison. Felix pressed, insisting that Rasputin try the excellent Madeira, that he must taste these particular cakes. Eventually Rasputin acquiesced. What happened next has been the subject of debate and confusion for decades. According to Felix's account, the primary source for the murder's details, though hardly an objective one, Rasputin consumed several poisoned cakes and drank 2 glasses of poisoned wine. The amount of cyanide ingested should have been massively lethal, yet Rasputin showed no ill effects. He continued talking, asked about when Princess Irina would appear, seemed entirely unaffected by poison that should have killed him within minutes. Felix watched in growing horror as minutes stretched into an hour, then longer. Rasputin ate more cakes, drank more wine, complained only that the wine was rather sweet. He asked Felix to play guitar and sing, which Felix did, his voice probably shaking with tension, as he performed while watching for signs that the poison was taking effect. Nothing. Rasputin seemed not merely alive, but comfortable, showing no distress whatsoever. Modern analysis has suggested several possible explanations for the poison's failure. Perhaps the cyanide had degraded. The chemical is not particularly stable and loses potency if not stored properly. Perhaps the heat of baking the cakes had destroyed the poison mixed into them. Perhaps the sugar in the wine and cakes had somehow neutralized the cyanide's effect. Or perhaps Dr. Lazovert, overcome by nerves or moral qualms, had not actually administered lethal doses. Another theory, proposed by some historians, is that Felix simply lied about the poison's use. Perhaps they never actually poisoned the food and wine, and this element was added to the story later to enhance the legend of Rasputin's supernatural resistance to death. The truth remains unknown, buried with all the participants. What is certain is that Felix, watching the poison fail and feeling his carefully laid plan collapsing, made a decision. He excused himself, claiming he needed to check on the party upstairs. He climbed to where Purishkevich and Dmitri waited, and told them the poison had failed. The conspirators conferred briefly. They had gone too far to retreat. Rasputin had been brought to the palace, would know something was wrong if allowed to leave. The only option was more direct violence. Dmitri provided a revolver, a Browning pistol that would become infamous in Russian history. Felix returned to the basement alone, the gun concealed. Rasputin had become restless, asking again about Princess Irina, suggesting perhaps he should leave if she was not available. Felix, improvising desperately, suggested Rasputin look at a particular crucifix in the room, an Italian piece from the Renaissance. As Rasputin bent to examine it, Felix drew the revolver and fired. The bullet struck Rasputin in the left side of the chest near the heart. He fell, crying out, collapsing onto the white bearskin rug that covered the floor. Blood spread across his embroidered shirt. Felix, convinced the deed was done, ran upstairs to tell the others. The conspirators came down to examine the body. Rasputin lay motionless. His breathing apparently stopped. His eyes closed. Dr. Lazovert checked for pulse and heartbeat, pronounced him dead. The conspirators, relieved that the murder was finally complete, returned upstairs to discuss disposal of the body. They would wrap it, weight it with chains, drop it through a hole in the ice of the Neva. The plan was proceeding, if messily, toward completion. Felix, alone with his thoughts and perhaps unable to resist one final look at the man he had killed, returned to the basement. He approached Rasputin's body where it lay on the bearskin rug, and then, in the detail that would cement Rasputin's legend forever, the corpse suddenly convulsed and opened its eyes. What Felix later described defies medical probability, but is attested to by his account and partially by others. Rasputin's eyes opened, fixed on Felix with an expression of malevolence or perhaps simple rage. The supposedly dead man lunged upward, grabbing at Felix, tearing at his clothing, one epaulette torn from Felix's jacket. Felix screamed, tore himself away, and ran for the stairs while behind him Rasputin somehow rose to his feet. The holy man, shot through the chest and supposedly dead, began crawling toward the stairs, then walking, then making his way to the courtyard door. Servants later testified to seeing this, a bloodied figure moving with desperate determination, leaving a trail of blood across the floor. Felix, hysterical, reached the upstairs rooms screaming that Rasputin had come back to life. Purishkevich, hearing the commotion, grabbed his own revolver and ran to the courtyard. There he saw Rasputin in the snow-covered yard, attempting to reach the gate that opened onto the street. Purishkevich raised his revolver and fired. The first shot missed. The second struck Rasputin in the back. Rasputin fell, tried to rise again. Purishkevich fired again, this bullet striking the head. Rasputin finally collapsed and lay still. But even then, the conspirators were not certain. They approached the body cautiously, as one might approach a wounded bear. Felix, in a state of hysteria that suggests complete psychological breakdown, picked up a length of wood, or perhaps a rubber club, accounts differ, and began beating the fallen body, striking the head repeatedly with manic fury. Finally convinced that Rasputin must be dead, shot multiple times, beaten, lying motionless in the snow, they carried the body back inside. They wrapped it in a blue curtain, bound it with ropes, weighted it with chains. In the early hours of December 30th, they loaded the wrapped corpse into an automobile and drove to Petrovsky Bridge over the Neva. There, through a hole in the ice, they pushed the body into the freezing water beneath. The conspirators separated, agreeing to say nothing, to deny everything. They cleaned the palace as best they could, though blood remained. They burned Rasputin's coat and boots in the fire. They tried to create alibis. By dawn, they had convinced themselves that the deed was done, the secret kept, and that Russia would awaken to find itself somehow saved by their night's work. But secrets involving murder rarely stay kept. Within hours, the Ukraina was searching for the missing Rasputin. His daughters had reported that he went to visit Prince Yusupov and never returned. The police found blood in the Moika Palace courtyard, found one of Rasputin's boots that had been overlooked in the cleanup. Felix's denials were transparently false. By December 31st, investigators were searching the Neva. On January 1st, 1917, a river policeman noticed a brown fur coat frozen into the ice near Petrovsky Bridge. Further investigation revealed the body, wrapped in its blue curtain, caught against the ice downstream from where it had been thrown. The corpse was recovered and taken for examination. The autopsy would become the source of the final legend. The examiner noted bullet wounds, one to the chest, one to the back, one to the head. He noted evidence of beating, but he also noted water in the lungs. This suggested that when Rasputin entered the water, he was still breathing. That he had survived poison, multiple gunshot wounds, and savage beating, only to finally drown beneath the ice of the Neva River. Whether this autopsy finding was accurate or whether water entered the lungs after death through some natural process remains debated by forensic experts. But the report fed the legend that would never die, that Rasputin could not be killed by ordinary means, that he survived everything his murderers did to him, that he possessed some supernatural vitality that resisted death until the very end. The night of December 29, 1916 became legend. The poison that failed to work, the resurrection from apparent death, the chase through the courtyard, the multiple bullets required to finally stop him, the water in the lungs suggesting he drowned while still alive. All of it combined to create a story that seemed to confirm everything his followers had claimed and his enemies had feared. Rasputin in death became even more powerful as a symbol than he had been in life. The conspirators, who had hoped to save Russia through murder, had instead created a martyr whose legend would long outlive the dynasty they sought to protect. The night of poison and bullets had ended with Rasputin dead beneath the ice. But the consequences of that night's work would echo through the months ahead, contributing to the final collapse of 300 years of Romanov rule. Chapter 12, Blood in the Snow, the discovery of Rasputin's body on January 1st, 1917, transformed a murder into a political crisis of the first magnitude. What the conspirators had hoped to conceal as an unexplained disappearance had become instead a public scandal that would accelerate rather than arrest the empire's disintegration. The blood that stained the snow of the Moika Palace courtyard, the blood that had frozen into the ice of the Neva River, became symbolic of the blood that would soon flow through Russia in quantities beyond imagining. The Tsarina's reaction to news of Rasputin's death was devastating and absolute. When informed that the body had been recovered, that her friend had been murdered by conspirators including members of the imperial family itself, Alexandra collapsed in grief that seemed to consume her entire being. She wept uncontrollably, refused food, would not leave her chambers. Her daughters, themselves devastated by the loss of the man they believed had saved their brother, tried to comfort her, but found her inconsolable. For Alexandra, Rasputin's death was not merely the loss of a trusted advisor, or even of the one person who could ease her son's suffering. It was the confirmation of her darkest fears, that enemies surrounded the throne, that conspiracy threatened the dynasty, that the forces of evil had triumphed over God's chosen messenger. In her grief and rage, she demanded immediate and terrible punishment for the murderers. She wanted them executed, their property confiscated, their names erased from history. Nicholas, returning to Tsarskoye Selo from military headquarters, found his wife in a state approaching madness. He shared her grief, though not with the same desperate intensity. Nicholas had valued Rasputin primarily because Alexandra valued him, because the holy man seemed able to help Alexei, because removing him would have caused unbearable conflict with his wife. But Nicholas had also found Rasputin increasingly burdensome, a source of endless political difficulty. His feelings about the murder were therefore more conflicted than Alexandra's pure anguish. The Tsar faced an impossible situation. His wife demanded harsh punishment for the conspirators, but the conspirators included Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, whom Nicholas had helped raise and loved like a son. They included Prince Felix Yusupov, married to his niece. They had the support of vast segments of society, from the Duma to the military to the common people, all of whom viewed Rasputin's removal as necessary and even heroic. The investigation proceeded with the grim efficiency of the Okhrana dealing with a case involving the imperial family. The conspirators' stories collapsed under minimal questioning. The evidence was overwhelming. Blood in Felix's palace, witnesses who had seen the automobile that night, the body's location corresponding to the conspirators' route. Within days, the Okhrana had compiled a complete account of the murder, lacking only the willing cooperation of the murderers themselves, who maintained a facade of innocence that fooled no one. Public reaction to the murder was complex and revealed the depth of Russia's divisions. In the Duma, deputies openly celebrated, though they could not do so officially. Milyukov and Purishkevich, the latter now revealed as one of the assassins, were treated as heroes when they appeared in public. Crowds gathered outside Felix's palace, not to condemn him but to cheer. Soldiers at the front, when they heard the news, reportedly celebrated that the dark force had been removed. Yet there were also genuine mourners. Rasputin's devotees, the women who had believed absolutely in his holiness, wept openly. Peasants in some villages, hearing that one of their own who had risen to advise the Tsar had been murdered by nobles, saw class warfare rather than patriotic necessity. And Alexandra's grief was shared by a small circle of true believers who had experienced Rasputin's interventions as genuine miracles. The funeral became the final act in the drama of Rasputin's life, and it was conducted with a secrecy that reflected both grief and shame. Alexandra insisted that he be buried near the palace at Zarskoye Selo, in a plot she had selected on the grounds of a church still under construction. The burial took place on January 3rd in the early morning darkness, attended only by the imperial family and a handful of servants. It was a scene of almost unbearable pathos. The Tsar and Tsarina of all Russia, their 4 daughters and their son standing in the frozen darkness as a peasant mystic's body was lowered into ground that had to be broken with picks because it was frozen solid. Alexandra placed in the coffin an icon signed by herself, Nicholas and their children. She had written on it a message expressing her conviction that Rasputin had been a martyr, killed by enemies of Russia and the throne. The Empress and her daughters wept throughout the brief service. Alexei, only 12 years old, watched in confusion as the only man who had ever been able to ease his suffering was buried. Nicholas stood rigid, perhaps mourning, perhaps simply enduring another impossible moment in a reign that had consisted increasingly of such moments. As the frozen earth was shoveled over the coffin, Alexandra apparently whispered prayers and promises that she would never forget, that his sacrifice would not be in vain, that his murderers would face divine justice. The question of punishment for the conspirators became a test of Nicholas's authority and revealed its almost complete erosion. Alexandra demanded death for all involved. But Nicholas, facing the reality of his political weakness, could impose only minimal consequences. Grand Duke Dmitry was not arrested but was instead ordered to join a military unit being sent to Persia, effectively a comfortable exile that probably saved his life, as he would be safely away from Russia when the revolution came. Felix Yusupov was likewise not arrested but was exiled to his country estates, where he lived in continued luxury. Purishkevich faced no official punishment whatsoever. As a Duma deputy, he enjoyed some immunity, but more crucially, any attempt to punish him would have provoked a political crisis that Nicholas's government was too weak to sustain. Purishkevich returned to his work with the military medical trains, celebrated as a hero by most of the army and much of the public. The leniency infuriated Alexandra, but demonstrated a political reality that she refused to acknowledge. Nicholas could no longer punish those who defied him, even when they murdered someone under his direct protection. The autocracy that claimed absolute authority could not enforce its will against murderers who had acted with society's tacit approval. The weakness was fatal, a sign that the regime's legitimacy had evaporated to the point where even murder of someone intimate with the throne could not be adequately punished. Members of the extended Romanov family, who might have been expected to be appalled by the murder of someone close to the Tsar and Tsarina, instead sent Nicholas a collective letter defending Dmitri and urging mercy. The letter was extraordinary. Grand Dukes and Duchesses essentially telling the Tsar that they supported the murder of someone he and his wife valued. Nicholas's response was cold fury, but he could do nothing beyond expressing his anger. The international reaction added another dimension to the crisis. The British and French governments, allies of Russia in the war against Germany, responded with barely concealed relief. Their ambassadors filed reports noting that Rasputin's removal might stabilise Russian governance and make Russia a more effective military ally. Some British officials had apparently considered assassinating Rasputin themselves, viewing him as more damaging to the Allied war effort than many German commanders. There were even rumours, never proven but persistent, that British intelligence had been involved in the murder plot, that an agent had been present at the Moika Palace that night. These rumours were probably false, arising from the British government's later attempts to distance itself from any connection to the crime. But the rumour's existence reflected the international dimension of Rasputin's influence and the relief that his death generated even among Russia's allies. Yet if the conspirators and those who supported them believed that Rasputin's death would save Russia, they were to be bitterly disappointed. The murder changed nothing fundamental and may have actually accelerated collapse. The government continued its paralysis. Removing Rasputin did not make the ministers more competent or the bureaucracy more efficient. The military continued suffering defeats and catastrophic casualties. Rasputin's death did not somehow improve supply lines or command decisions. The people continued starving. Bread queues did not shorten because the holy man was dead. More crucially, Rasputin's death removed one of the few remaining emotional anchors that had kept Alexandra and Nicholas connected to reality. With our friend gone, Alexandra's paranoia deepened into near-complete detachment from the actual situation. She convinced herself that Rasputin's death was the beginning of the prophesied doom, that his martyrdom had triggered the catastrophe he had warned about. She withdrew even further from society, seeing enemies everywhere, trusting no one outside the immediate family. Nicholas, deprived of the counsel, however dubious, that had been filtered through Rasputin and Alexandra, seemed even more paralysed than before. He returned to military headquarters, burying himself in the details of troop movements and supply requisitions, avoiding the impossible political decisions that effective leadership would have required. The murder had not freed him from Rasputin's influence, but had instead removed a structure, however flawed, that had at least provided some framework for decision-making. The conspirators themselves discovered that murder brought not salvation, but merely different problems. Felix found himself socially isolated even among those who had supported the killing. Something about the actual deed, about the poison and bullets and beating, disturbed even those who had wished for Rasputin's death. Dmitri, exiled to Persia, watched from distance as the empire collapsed. Purishkevich, who had acted from genuine patriotic conviction, lived to see the revolution sweep away the monarchy he had tried to save. In the weeks following the murder, Russia continued its slide toward catastrophe with accelerating speed. The winter of 1917 was particularly brutal, with temperatures plunging to depths that froze fuel supplies and made transportation nearly impossible. Food shortages in Petrograd became severe, with bread lines stretching for blocks in temperatures that could freeze flesh in minutes. Workers in the factories, already strained by wartime demands and inadequate pay, began striking with increasing frequency. The Duma, emboldened by the government's obvious weakness and the public support for Rasputin's murder, became increasingly confrontational. Deputies openly discussed the need for a responsible ministry, for a government answerable to Parliament rather than to the Tsar. Some went further, speaking in guarded terms about the possibility that Nicholas himself might need to be removed, that a regency might be necessary, that the system of autocracy might need fundamental reform. Alexandra, isolated in her grief and convinced that conspiracy surrounded her, urged Nicholas to take harsh action against the Duma and against all who opposed autocracy. Her letters from this period are increasingly divorced from reality, speaking of the need for strength, for crushing the revolution before it could begin, for ruling as the old Tsars had ruled, with absolute authority and without compromise. She seemed incapable of recognizing that the power to rule absolutely no longer existed, that the authority of the throne had eroded beyond recovery. Rasputin's grave at Tsarskoye Selo became a site of Alexandra's daily pilgrimage. She would visit the plot where he was buried, would pray there for hours, would speak to the dead holy man as if he could still hear and respond. Servants reported that she seemed to believe Rasputin was somehow still present, still guiding her, still protecting the family from beyond death. The behaviour suggested a mind teetering on the edge of complete breakdown. The snow continued to fall through January and into February, covering Petrograd in white that grew grey with coal smoke and industrial grime. The bread queues lengthened, the strikes multiplied. The soldiers garrisoned in the capital, many of them newly drafted peasants with no loyalty to the regime, grew restless and sympathetic to the workers' complaints. Revolutionary organisers, sensing opportunity, intensified their agitation. Rasputin had prophesied, before his death, that if nobles killed him, the Tsar and his family would not survive 2 years. He had been wrong about the timeline. It would not take 2 years, but less than 2 months. The blood in the snow of December would be followed by rivers of blood in the streets of Petrograd in February and March. The murder that was supposed to save the dynasty would prove to be merely a prelude to its complete destruction. On February 23, 1917, International Women's Day, strikes and demonstrations erupted in Petrograd with unusual intensity. Women workers, demanding bread and better conditions, took to the streets. They were joined by male workers from the factories. The demonstrations grew, spreading through working-class districts. The government, paralysed by incompetence and the Tsar's absence at military headquarters, failed to respond effectively. Over the following days, the demonstrations transformed into revolution. Soldiers ordered to fire on demonstrators instead joined them. The Duma defied the Tsar's order to dissolve. Soviets, workers' councils, formed and began exercising authority in opposition to the government. The 300-year-old autocracy was collapsing with stunning speed. Nicholas, receiving confused and contradictory reports at headquarters, finally attempted to return to Tsarskoye Selo. His train was stopped by revolutionary soldiers. On March 2, 1917, faced with the reality that he commanded nothing, that even his own generals urged him to abdicate, Nicholas signed away the throne that had been held by his family since 1613. The dynasty that Rasputin had supposedly been protecting, that Alexandra had believed he was sent by God to preserve, had fallen barely 2 months after his death. The blood in the snow of Rasputin's murder had been a harbinger. The prophecy he had made was being fulfilled with terrible precision. The nobles had killed him. The Tsar was falling, and Russia herself was descending into a chaos that would make the suffering of the war years seem mild by comparison. Chapter 13. The Empire's Final Winter. The revolution that exploded in February 1917, or March by the Western calendar that Russia would soon adopt, unfolded with a speed that caught even its instigators by surprise. What began as strikes and bread riots in Petrograd transformed within days into the complete collapse of the autocratic system that had ruled Russia for centuries. The empire did not fall to a carefully planned insurrection, but rather dissolved like snow in spring rain, all the accumulated weaknesses suddenly revealed as fatal. The immediate cause was prosaic: bread. By late February, the food situation in Petrograd had become desperate. The railways, strained beyond capacity by military demands, could not deliver adequate supplies to the capital. Bakeries ran out of flour. Lines for bread stretched for hours in temperatures that could kill the weak and elderly who waited. Women who had endured 3 years of war, who had watched husbands and sons die at the front, who had worked in factories for wages that bought less each month, finally reached the breaking point. On February 23rd, the demonstrations began in the working-class districts on the Vyborg side of the Neva. Women textile workers walked off their jobs and marched through the streets, demanding bread and an end to the war. They were joined by workers from the metal factories, men who had been classified as essential to the war effort and thus not drafted, but who had become radicalized by years of terrible working conditions and falling real wages. The demonstrations grew each day, spreading from the industrial districts to the center of the city. By February 25th, over 200,000 workers were on strike. They marched toward the Nevsky Prospect, the great boulevard that symbolized imperial elegance, bringing with them banners demanding bread, peace, and increasingly an end to autocracy. The police attempted to disperse them, but the crowds were too large and too determined. The government, such as it was, responded with paralysis that reflected the incompetence Rasputin's influence had helped to create. Prime Minister Prince Golitsyn, a non-entity appointed because he would not oppose the Tsarina's interference, had no idea what to do. The Minister of Internal Affairs, Protopopov, Rasputin's promoted man, mentally unstable and possibly syphilitic, gave contradictory orders and may have been having conversations with icons rather than addressing the actual crisis. Nicholas, at military headquarters in Mogilev, hundreds of miles from the capital, received reports that minimized the danger. His generals, accustomed to protecting him from bad news, suggested this was merely another round of strikes that would pass. Nicholas, exhausted by the impossible demands of command and perhaps secretly relieved to be away from Alexandra's emotional intensity, accepted these reassurances. On February 25th, he sent a telegram to the Petrograd military commander ordering that the disorders be stopped immediately. How this was to be accomplished, he did not specify. The Petrograd garrison, tasked with suppressing the demonstrations, was the weak link that would break the regime. The garrison consisted largely of reserve units, older men, new recruits, peasants who had been given minimal training and less indoctrination in loyalty to the throne. Many had been pulled from hospitals, technically recovered from wounds but still bearing the psychological scars of combat. They had no enthusiasm for firing on workers and women whose complaints seemed justified. On February 26th, soldiers fired on demonstrators in several locations, killing dozens. The violence seemed to have worked. By evening, the streets were empty and officials congratulated themselves on suppressing the revolt. But that night, in the barracks of the Pavlovsky regiment, soldiers who had participated in the shooting discussed what they had done. Some wept, others raged. They had signed up to fight Germans, not to kill Russian women begging for bread. The next morning, February 27th, when the soldiers of the Volinsky regiment were ordered to deploy against demonstrators, they refused. More than that, they shot their commanding officer and marched to join the protesters. The mutiny spread with stunning rapidity. Regiment after regiment either refused orders or actively joined the revolution. By afternoon, soldiers and workers together controlled much of the city. They attacked police stations, released prisoners, seized the Peter and Paul fortress with its arsenal of weapons. The Duma, theoretically dissolved by Nicholas's telegram but refusing to disband, became a focal point for those seeking to create a new government. Liberal politicians like Milyukov and more radical figures like Alexander Kerensky found themselves trying to channel revolutionary energy into constitutional forms. Simultaneously, workers and soldiers were forming Soviets, councils that claimed authority based on revolutionary legitimacy rather than legal continuity. At Tsarskoye Selo, 15 miles from the revolutionary capital, Alexandra found herself besieged. The palace was surrounded by soldiers of uncertain loyalty. Communications with Nicholas were disrupted. Her children were ill with measles, several of them seriously so, adding medical crisis to political catastrophe. Alone, with only a handful of loyal retainers, she faced the collapse of everything she had believed unshakable. Her response revealed both courage and complete delusion. She wrote to Nicholas describing the situation in terms that minimized the danger, perhaps unable to accept the reality of revolution. She urged him to be strong, to crush the rebellion without mercy. She apparently believed that firm action could still restore order, that the unrest was merely another challenge to be overcome through faith and determination. Nicholas, finally recognizing the severity of the crisis, attempted to return to Tsarskoye Selo. His train departed Mogilev on February 28th, but was stopped by revolutionary soldiers who had seized the railways. He was redirected to Pskov, where the headquarters of the Northern Front was located. There, cut off from his family and his capital, he received a delegation of generals and Duma representatives who told him the truth he had been avoiding. The dynasty was finished. The generals, practical men concerned with maintaining military effectiveness against Germany, had concluded that Nicholas's abdication was necessary. The Duma representatives were more blunt. The revolution would not be stopped, and Nicholas's continued rule was impossible. They offered him a choice: abdicate in favour of his son Alexei, with Nicholas's brother Grand Duke Mikhail serving as regent, or face complete chaos that might destroy not merely the dynasty but Russia itself. On March 2nd, in his railway car at Pskov, Nicholas made his decision, but he altered what was proposed. He would abdicate not only for himself but for Alexei as well. His reasoning, never explicitly stated but obvious to those who knew the situation, was that Alexei's hemophilia made him unsuitable to rule. More profoundly, Nicholas could not bear to be separated from his son. If the dynasty fell, the family would face it together. He abdicated in favour of his brother Mikhail, but Mikhail, more politically astute than Nicholas, recognised that accepting the throne would make him a target. He refused unless a constituent assembly, representing the people's will, confirmed his succession. It was a demurral that amounted to effective abdication. The Romanov dynasty, 300 years of unbroken rule, had ended not with dramatic violence but with a series of hesitations and refusals. When Nicholas finally reached Tsarskoye Selo on March 8th, he returned not as Tsar but as Colonel Romanov, a private citizen under house arrest. He was reunited with Alexandra and his sick children in the palace that had been their refuge from the world. Now it was their prison. Guards, ostensibly for their protection but actually their jailers, surrounded the premises. The couple who had ruled millions now commanded nothing beyond their immediate rooms. Alexandra's reaction to the abdication mixed grief, anger, and apparently continuing inability to grasp reality. She blamed everyone: the Duma, the generals, the people, the conspirators who had killed Rasputin. She could not seem to understand that the system of autocracy had collapsed, that Nicholas's rule had been fundamentally unsustainable. In her mind, they had been betrayed rather than overthrown, victims of conspiracy rather than of their own failures. For Nicholas, there seemed almost a sense of relief mixed with grief. The burden he had carried for 23 years, the burden he had never wanted and never been adequate to bear, was lifted. His diary entries from this period are banal. He noted the weather, the children's recovery from measles, small domestic details. He seemed to be retreating into the private life he had always preferred, treating his family's imprisonment as merely another trial to be endured with resignation. The provisional government, formed from Duma leaders and claiming to represent legal continuity, now nominally ruled Russia. But real power was fractured between this government and the Petrograd Soviet, between forces wanting constitutional evolution and those demanding revolutionary transformation. The situation was inherently unstable, what would later be called dual power, and it could not last. More revolution was coming, not the relatively bloodless February Revolution that had toppled the Tsar, but the Bolshevik seizure of power in October that would replace the provisional government with communist dictatorship. Between February and October, Russia would experience a period of chaotic freedom, of competing visions for the nation's future, of hope that rapidly soured into violence and disintegration. For the imperial family, confined at Tsarskoye Selo, the situation grew more precarious with each passing week. The provisional government, dominated by moderates, initially considered allowing them to go into exile, perhaps to England, where Nicholas's cousin King George V ruled. But the Soviet, representing more radical forces, opposed this. They demanded the Romanovs be held to account for centuries of oppression. As spring arrived and snow melted, as revolution deepened and the provisional government's authority eroded, the family's fate became increasingly uncertain. They were moved in August 1917 from Tsarskoye Selo to Tobolsk in Siberia, ostensibly for their safety, actually to place them further from potential rescue and deeper into revolutionary territory. In Tobolsk, in a commandeered governor's house, the family lived in increasingly reduced circumstances through the winter of 1917-1918. They were guarded by soldiers whose attitude shifted from respect to hostility as the revolution radicalized. Nicholas chopped wood and shoveled snow. Alexandra worried constantly about Alexei, who had suffered several bleeding episodes. The children tried to maintain normalcy through study and prayer and family games, but normalcy was impossible in a world being torn apart. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, overthrowing the provisional government and establishing a dictatorship in the name of the proletariat. In March 1918, Russia signed a humiliating peace with Germany, surrendering vast territories to exit the war. And throughout Russia, civil war was beginning. Reds against whites, Bolsheviks against everyone who opposed them, with catastrophic violence spreading across the vast empire. The family was moved again in April 1918, this time to Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains, to a house that had been requisitioned from a merchant. The House of Special Purpose, as it was officially designated, was their final prison. The windows were painted white so they could not see out. Guards watched their every movement. Their possessions were gradually confiscated. They were permitted one walk daily in the small courtyard, always under guard. The empire's final winter had passed into spring and summer, but for the Romanovs, winter would be eternal. They were living through their last months, though they could not have known it. Rasputin's prophecy that the Tsar and his family would not survive 2 years if he was killed by nobles was approaching its fulfillment with terrible precision. The murder had not saved Russia or the dynasty. It had merely provided an overture to catastrophe. The blood in the snow had been a beginning, not an ending. And the ending, when it came in that basement in Ekaterinburg, would be as brutal and final as Rasputin's drowning beneath the ice of the Neva, except that this time an entire dynasty would drown in blood, and with it, the world that had created and sustained it for 3 centuries. Chapter 14. The Romanovs' Grim Fate. The summer of 1918 descended upon Ekaterinburg with unusual warmth, a mockery of the darkness that was closing around the imperial family imprisoned in the House of Special Purpose. Outside those whitewashed windows, Russia was tearing itself apart in civil war of unprecedented savagery. Inside, 7 members of the Romanov family and 4 loyal servants waited in shrinking space and fading hope for a fate they could sense approaching but could not prevent. The house itself was unremarkable from the outside, a 2-story merchant's residence confiscated by the Bolsheviks and converted into a prison. But it had been transformed into something approaching a dungeon. A high wooden fence surrounded the property, blocking sight of the street. Guards watched from posts at all hours. The family's movements were restricted to a few rooms on the upper floor and brief daily walks in a tiny courtyard where guards could observe their every movement. Nicholas, now 49 years old, had aged visibly during the year of captivity. His beard had grown white, his face lined with resignation that bordered on apathy. He spent his days reading aloud to his family, playing cards, doing small physical tasks that gave the illusion of purpose. His diary entries remained determinedly banal: the weather, the meals, small incidents. If he contemplated the approaching end, he gave no sign in these daily notations. Alexandra, only 46 but looking years older, suffered from a heart condition that made walking difficult. She spent much time in a wheelchair, reading religious texts and praying before icons the family had been permitted to keep. Her faith remained absolute, though its object had shifted. With Rasputin dead, she directed her prayers to God directly, believing still that divine providence would somehow save them, that martyrdom would be avoided at the last moment by miraculous intervention. The children, Olga aged 22, Tatiana 21, Maria 19, Anastasia 17, and Alexei 13, maintained a courage that was heartbreaking to witness. The girls tried to keep spirits up through songs and games. They sewed jewels into their clothing, treasures hidden against a future they tried to believe might come. Alexei, suffering from another episode of bleeding in his groin that made movement agonizing, bore his pain with the stoicism he had learned through years of such episodes. Without Rasputin, there was no one to ease his suffering, no hypnotic voice to make the pain recede. The servants who had chosen to remain with the family demonstrated a loyalty that transcended class and self-interest. Dr. Evgeny Botkin, the family physician, could have fled but stayed. Anna Demidova, Alexandra's maid, remained despite opportunities to leave. Alexei Trup, the footman, and Ivan Kharitonov, the cook, both served the family in captivity as they had in glory, knowing their loyalty might prove fatal. The guards assigned to watch the family grew progressively more hostile as summer advanced. Initially, soldiers with some residual respect for their prisoners had performed this duty. But as the revolution radicalized and as the Bolsheviks' hold on power remained precarious, harder men took over. They were often workers or peasants who saw the Romanovs not as tragic fallen monarchs, but as symbols of centuries of oppression. Some guards scrawled obscene graffiti on the walls where the family could see. Others made crude jokes in their presence. The atmosphere was one of barely restrained violence. The civil war was going badly for the Bolsheviks in the Urals region. White forces, anti-Bolshevik armies loosely coordinated under various generals and supported by foreign powers, were advancing toward Ekaterinburg. By July 1918, it was clear that the city might fall within days or weeks. This military situation sealed the Romanovs' fate. The Bolshevik leadership in Moscow, particularly Vladimir Lenin and Yakov Sverdlov, made the decision that the family could not be allowed to fall into white hands, where they might become rallying symbols for counter-revolution. The order came from Moscow in early July, though its exact form and precise authorization remain debated by historians. What is certain is that Yakov Yurovsky, a Bolshevik true believer and former photographer, was placed in command of the house with explicit instructions. The imperial family was to be executed. All of them, parents, children, servants. There were to be no survivors, no witnesses, no bodies that could become relics for the counter-revolution. Yurovsky began preparations with methodical attention to detail. He selected a dozen men from among the guards and local Cheka, secret police operatives, who could be trusted to carry out the executions without hesitation. He identified the basement room where the killings would occur, a semi-underground chamber about 25 feet square with whitewashed walls and a single window. He arranged for a truck to transport the bodies and recruited workers who could help dispose of them in a location that would not be easily discovered. The night of July 16th and 17, 1918, was when prophecy became reality, when Rasputin's warning fulfilled itself with terrible precision, when the blood he had predicted would drown Russia and the Romanov family finally flowed. The family had retired to bed at their usual hour, unaware that this would be their last night alive. Around midnight, Yurovsky woke them, telling them that there was unrest in the town and that for their safety, they needed to move to the basement. The family dressed, Nicholas in a military tunic, Alexandra in a dark dress, the children in simple clothing. They woke their servants. Alexei, unable to walk due to his bleeding episode, was carried by Nicholas. They descended to the basement room. Yurovsky told them to wait there while transportation was arranged. Nicholas asked for chairs, and two were brought, one for Alexandra, one for Alexei. The family arranged themselves in the small space. Nicholas and Alexei near the back wall, Alexandra seated to the side, the four daughters standing behind their parents, the servants ranged against another wall. They waited in confused silence, perhaps sensing something wrong but unable to identify what or act upon that instinct. Yurovsky left to gather his execution squad. 12 men, soldiers, Chekists, and some foreign revolutionaries who had been fighting with the Bolsheviks, assembled in the adjacent room. They were given revolvers and assigned specific targets. Yurovsky would shoot Nicholas. The others would each take one of the remaining family members or servants. The instructions were clear: shoot to kill, aim for the heart, make it as quick as possible. At approximately 2:15 in the morning, Yurovsky led the execution squad into the basement room. The family looked up, perhaps expecting to be told they could return to their rooms. Instead, Yurovsky began reading from a piece of paper, informing them that the Ural Regional Soviet had ordered their execution. He read in a flat, bureaucratic tone, as if announcing a change in regulations rather than imminent death. Nicholas, according to Yurovsky's later account, had time only to say, "What?" before Yurovsky shot him in the chest. The other executioners opened fire. The small room filled with smoke and the deafening noise of multiple revolvers firing simultaneously. Alexandra attempted to make the sign of the cross. Olga and Tatiana, the two eldest daughters, tried to shield themselves. The servants cowered against the walls, but the execution did not go as planned. The daughters and Alexei did not fall when shot. The bullets seemed to ricochet off their bodies, striking the walls, causing injuries but not immediate death. In their terror and desperation to preserve something of value, the girls had sewn jewels and diamonds into their clothing, pounds of precious stones distributed across the bodices of their dresses. These improvised armor plates deflected the first volleys. The room became a scene from hell itself. Screaming, smoke, the smell of gunpowder and blood. The executioners, panicked by the failure of their bullets to immediately kill, began using bayonets. They stabbed at the writhing bodies, at the children who would not die quickly, at the daughters whose screams filled the basement. Some of the executioners were reportedly sickened by what they were doing, but Yurovsky drove them on, demanding they finish the work. Anastasia, the youngest daughter, had apparently only been wounded and had fainted. When the executioners paused to assess their work, she stirred and cried out. She was finished with bayonets. Alexei, the boy whose hemophilia had brought Rasputin to power, ironically survived the initial shooting, only to be finished with multiple shots to the head as he lay wounded. The bleeding that had plagued his life meant he would have bled to death from his wounds, but the executioners did not wait for natural death. When it was finally over, perhaps 20 minutes after it began, though time in such circumstances loses normal measure, 11 people lay dead or dying in a basement room in Ekaterinburg. The Tsar of all Russia, his empress, his 4 daughters, his son and heir, and 4 loyal servants had been murdered by men who believed they were preventing counter-revolution and advancing the cause of the proletariat. The bodies were looted of any valuables that had not been destroyed by bullets. The jewels sewn into the daughters' clothing were recovered, wedding rings were removed, then the corpses were loaded onto a truck covered with a tarpaulin and driven into the forest outside Ekaterinburg. The executioners followed with supplies, sulfuric acid, gasoline, shovels. At an abandoned mine shaft called Ganina Yama, about 12 miles from the city, the disposal began. Yurovsky had been ordered to make the bodies disappear so completely that they could never become relics. He attempted to burn them with gasoline and destroy the remains with sulfuric acid. But burning 11 bodies completely proved impossible with the resources available. The fire consumed clothing and flesh but left bones and teeth. After hours of this grim work, Yurovsky decided on a different approach. He selected 2 of the bodies, probably Alexei and one of the daughters, though identification was made difficult by the burning, and buried them separately in a shallow grave near where the truck had become stuck earlier. The remaining 9 bodies were buried in a second grave, deeper and carefully concealed. Wooden planks were placed over the burial site, and the truck was driven over them repeatedly to pack the earth and obscure evidence of digging. The executioners returned to Ekaterinburg at dawn on July 17th. The basement room was washed down, though blood had soaked into the floorboards and walls where bullets had struck. The furniture was removed. An official announcement was prepared. Nicholas Romanov had been executed by decision of the Ural Regional Soviet, but his family had been moved to a place of safety. This lie was maintained for days, giving the Bolsheviks time to consolidate their story before the truth began to emerge. The White forces captured Ekaterinburg on July 25th, just 8 days after the murders. They found the house of special purpose empty, blood in the basement, and scattered evidence of violence. Investigators began piecing together what had happened, interviewing guards who had fled, examining the site, searching for bodies. They found the mineshaft site, found evidence of burning, found charred bones and artifacts. But the main burial site remained undiscovered. News of the execution, when it finally reached the outside world, was met with horror in some quarters and grim satisfaction in others. The Allied powers, Britain, France, America, expressed official outrage while privately relieving themselves of the burden of having to demand the Romanovs' release. King George V of Britain, Nicholas's cousin, was reportedly stricken with guilt, having refused earlier pleas to grant the family asylum in England for fear of political complications. In Russia, the reaction was divided along the lines of civil war. Whites mourned and used the murders as propaganda, proof of Bolshevik barbarity and disregard for human life. The Reds justified the executions as revolutionary necessity. The Romanovs had been symbols of oppression, and their deaths prevented them from becoming rallying points for counter-revolution. To common people, exhausted by years of war and hardship, the news was received with varying degrees of indifference, anger, or satisfaction, depending on political alignment. For Alexandra and Nicholas, the end had come as Rasputin had prophesied. Killed by their own people, murdered in a basement, their blood spilled because they had failed to protect the man they believed God had sent to save them. The prophecy was fulfilled with gruesome accuracy. The nobles who had killed Rasputin in December 1916 had set in motion the chain of events that led to this basement in July 1918. The Tsar and his family had not survived even 18 months beyond Rasputin's death, let alone the 2 years he had predicted. The empire that had lasted 300 years ended not in glory but in a basement room's blood and smoke. The dynasty that claimed divine right to rule was extinguished by men who believed in no god but the historical inevitability of class warfare, and Rasputin, dead beneath the ice of the Neva 18 months earlier, had the grim satisfaction of prophecy fulfilled, though he was not alive to witness it. His warning had proven terribly precisely accurate. The bodies remained hidden for decades. The Soviet Union, built upon the revolution that had overthrown the Romanovs, had no interest in allowing the burial sites to be discovered and become pilgrimage destinations for monarchist sentiment. The locations remained secret, known only to a handful of officials who carried the knowledge to their own graves. It was not until 1979 that amateur historians, using clues from Yurovsky's memoirs and testimony, located the main burial site. They secretly exhumed the remains but reburied them, fearing Soviet authorities. Only in 1991, as the Soviet Union itself collapsed, were the remains officially exhumed. DNA testing confirmed the identities: Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 daughters, and the 4 servants. But 2 bodies were missing, Alexei and 1 daughter, probably Maria. The second burial site was not discovered until 2007. 2 more bodies, burned and fragmentary, were recovered, and DNA testing confirmed they were the missing Romanov children. The family was finally complete, though scattered across 2 graves and recovered nearly 90 years after their murder. In 1998, the remains from the first grave were given state burial in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of Russian Tsars. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized the family as passion bearers, martyrs who had accepted their fate with Christian resignation. The ceremony was attended by Russian officials, foreign dignitaries, and surviving Romanov relatives. The dynasty had finally received a proper burial, though the empire it had ruled was long extinct. The grim fate of the Romanovs in that Ekaterinburg basement was the culmination of everything Rasputin had represented and warned about. His influence had helped to delegitimize the dynasty. His death had removed a structure, however flawed, that had helped Nicholas and Alexandra navigate impossible circumstances. His prophecy had proven accurate with horrifying precision, and his legacy, the question of whether he had been holy man or charlatan, saviour or destroyer, would continue to be debated long after the blood had dried in that basement and the bones had been recovered from their forest grave. The Chapter 15, The Legend That Refuses to Die. Nearly a century after Grigori Rasputin drowned beneath the ice of the Neva River, his shadow stretches still across history and imagination, refusing to fade into the obscurity that claims most historical figures. The mad monk from Siberia has become something more than a man, transformed by time and retelling into a legend that encompasses questions about power, faith, corruption, and the mysterious forces that move through history in ways that rational analysis cannot fully explain. The first transformation of Rasputin from man to legend began even before his death. By 1916, he had already become a figure larger than life in the Russian imagination, simultaneously holy man and demon, healer and corrupter, peasant sage and drunken debauchee. The contradictions were not resolved by his death, but amplified. The theatrical nature of his assassination, the poison that failed, the bullets that could not kill him, the drowning beneath ice, provided material for a legend that would grow with each retelling. The accounts of his murder, as they circulated through Russia and then the wider world, became increasingly embellished. Felix Yusupov, the primary source for the event's details, wrote multiple versions of the story over his long life. He survived until 1967, dying in exile in Paris. Each version grew more dramatic, more gothic, more emphasizing Rasputin's apparent superhuman resistance to death. Whether Felix was deliberately mythologizing, or whether his own memory transformed under the influence of retelling, the effect was to cement Rasputin as a figure who defied natural law. The claim that Rasputin survived poison sufficient to kill multiple men, that he arose from apparent death after being shot in the heart, that he survived multiple gunshot wounds and savage beating, only to drown while still breathing. These details created an image of someone who was more than merely human. To his followers, this seemed proof of his holy nature, evidence that God protected him until the very end. To his enemies, it suggested diabolical power, a pact with dark forces that gave him unnatural vitality. modern forensic analysis has cast doubt on many details of the legend. The autopsy report that claimed water in the lungs may have been mistaken. Water can enter lungs after death through natural processes. The poison may never have been administered, or may have degraded before use, or may have been neutralized by the wine and sugar in the cakes. The apparent resurrection from the first gunshot wound might have been that Nicholas had not actually died, but merely lost consciousness, then revived. Rational explanations exist for everything that seemed supernatural. Yet the legend persists because it serves purposes beyond historical accuracy. Rasputin as an unkillable figure, as someone who defied death itself, becomes a metaphor for forces larger than individual human life. He represents the persistence of the irrational in a rational age, of faith and superstition in an era of science and progress, of the mysterious and inexplicable aspects of human existence that resist neat categorization. The question of his healing abilities has never been definitively resolved. Did he genuinely possess some power to stop Alexei's bleeding, or were his successes merely fortunate timing? Modern medicine has suggested various explanations. His hypnotic abilities, which by all accounts were considerable, might have induced deep relaxation that lowered blood pressure and reduced stress, both of which could help a hemophiliac's blood clot more effectively. His calming presence might have reduced Alexandra's anxiety, which in turn calmed Alexei, and since stress can exacerbate bleeding, this indirect effect might have been genuinely therapeutic. Some medical researchers have even suggested that Rasputin's opposition to aspirin, which he apparently advised against, might have been beneficial, since aspirin interferes with blood clotting and would have been particularly dangerous for a hemophiliac. If doctors were prescribing aspirin for pain relief, and Rasputin convinced Alexandra to stop giving it to Alexei, this alone might have reduced bleeding episodes and appeared as miraculous healing. Yet there remains testimony from multiple sources, including skeptics, that Rasputin could sometimes stop bleeding or ease pain in ways that seemed beyond natural explanation. Dr. Botkin, the family physician who was hardly inclined toward mysticism and who died alongside the family in Ekaterinburg, apparently admitted that Rasputin achieved results he could not explain medically. Whether this was genuine paranormal ability, hypnotic technique more sophisticated than medical science then understood, or simply the power of faith and suggestion remains unresolved. The question of Rasputin's character is equally resistant to simple resolution. Was he a genuine holy man whose rough exterior and unconventional behaviour masked authentic spirituality? Was he a cynical charlatan who recognised opportunity and exploited desperate people? Or was he, as seems most likely, a complex figure who contained elements of both, someone with genuine mystical experiences and beliefs who was also capable of manipulation, debauchery and corruption? His theology, such as it was, mixed Orthodox Christianity with folk beliefs, and possibly heretical elements from various Russian sectarian traditions. His teaching that sin was necessary for redemption, that one must descend into transgression to truly understand grace, echoed ideas that the Orthodox Church had condemned in movements like the Callisti. Yet he also displayed genuine piety at times, hours spent in prayer, pilgrimages undertaken with real devotion, moments of spiritual insight that impressed even skeptics. The peasant who walked thousands of miles to Jerusalem and Mount Athos was probably sincere in his spiritual seeking. The man who could comfort a mother watching her child suffer demonstrated genuine compassion, whatever other motives might have been present. But the drunk who propositioned women in restaurants, who boasted of his influence while showing contempt for those less powerful, who accepted bribes and interfered in government appointments for personal gain, this figure was equally real. Rasputin contained multitudes, contradictions that refused to resolve into simple judgment. His political influence and its consequences remain subjects of historical debate. Did his interference in appointments and strategy significantly contribute to Russia's military defeats and governmental paralysis? Or has he been made a scapegoat for systemic failures that ran far deeper than one man's influence could cause? The truth probably lies between these extremes. Rasputin's meddling was real and harmful, but the Russian Empire's problems, autocratic ossification, social inequality, economic backwardness, military incompetence, existed long before he arrived and would not have been solved by his absence. Yet his symbolic importance was immense. He became in the public imagination the embodiment of everything wrong with the regime, its corruption, its incompetence, its disconnection from the people it ruled. Whether or not he actually caused specific disasters mattered less than the fact that millions of Russians believed he did. This belief destroyed the monarchy's legitimacy as effectively as actual guilt would have. The association between Rasputin and the revolution that followed his death has created a narrative where he becomes either a cause of Russia's transformation or a symptom of inevitable collapse. Soviet historians generally portrayed him as evidence of Tsarist decadence and the necessity of revolution. A corrupt mystic controlling a weak monarch proved that autocracy was finished and communism was historically inevitable. Western historians, particularly during the Cold War, sometimes portrayed him as a villain whose malign influence pushed Russia toward Bolshevism that might otherwise have been avoided. More recent scholarship has attempted more nuanced assessment. Rasputin was neither cause nor mere symptom, but rather a catalyst and symbol. His presence accelerated processes already underway. His influence made bad situations worse. His assassination removed a figure who had become so inflammatory that his continued existence threatened the monarchy, but his removal came too late and solved too little. He was a factor in Russia's collapse, but not the only factor, perhaps not even the most important factor, though his dramatic story makes him memorable in ways that discussions of economic structure and social forces can never be. The cultural legacy of Rasputin has proven remarkably durable. He appears in literature, film, music, and popular imagination as a figure of dark fascination. He has been portrayed as demonic villain, as tragic figure, as comic buffoon, as misunderstood mystic. Each generation seems to reinvent him according to its own concerns and obsessions. In the immediate aftermath of his death and the revolution, Rasputin was portrayed in lurid terms by those writing memoirs and histories. The early accounts emphasize scandal and corruption, often inventing or embellishing incidents to make him appear more villainous. Princess Yusupova, Felix's mother, published a memoir that depicted Rasputin in the darkest possible terms. Various former courtiers and officials wrote accounts that blamed him for everything that had gone wrong, perhaps seeking to absolve themselves of responsibility for the regime's failures. The Soviet period saw Rasputin used as propaganda tool. He became evidence of the old regime's degeneracy, proof that revolution had been necessary. Soviet films and literature portrayed him as a drunken fraud who manipulated superstitious aristocrats, with the implication that only scientific socialism could free Russia from such mystical nonsense. Western interest in Rasputin grew particularly strong during the Cold War era, when his story seemed to offer insights into the mysterious Russian character and the forces that had created the Soviet Union. Biographies portrayed him variously as evil genius, as sexual predator, as agent of Germany, as innocent victim of court intrigue. Hollywood produced films that emphasized the sensational aspects, the debauchery, the hypnotic eyes, the theatrical murder. Accuracy mattered less than creating a compelling villain or tragic figure. More recently, with access to Russian archives and more sophisticated historical methodology, scholars have attempted to separate fact from legend. The task is complicated by the fact that much evidence is contradictory, that witnesses had axes to grind, that Rasputin himself left almost no direct testimony about his beliefs or motives. The man himself remains elusive, visible only through the distorting lens of others' perceptions and agendas. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized the Romanov family in 2000, declaring them passion bearers, martyrs who accepted their fate with Christian resignation. This raised anew questions about Rasputin. If the imperial family were saints, what did that make the man who had influenced them so profoundly? Some Orthodox believers see Rasputin as having been genuinely sent by God to test the family's faith. Others maintain he was a demonic deceiver who contributed to their martyrdom. The Church itself has avoided official pronouncement on Rasputin's spiritual status, perhaps recognizing that the question admits no simple answer. The site of Rasputin's murder at the Moika Palace has become a tourist attraction, with visitors coming to see the basement room where the legendary assassination occurred. The location of his grave has changed. After the February Revolution, his body was exhumed and burned by a crowd, denying him even the dignity of final rest. There is no monument marking where he died or was buried. His memory exists not in physical memorials but in the stories that continue to be told. The prophecy that made his legend particularly powerful, that if nobles killed him, the Tsar and family would die within 2 years and Russia would be drowned in blood, has been endlessly analysed. Was it genuine prophecy, evidence of mystical foresight? Was it shrewd political prediction, the obvious conclusion that his removal would not solve Russia's problems? Or was it simply fortunate coincidence that his warning happened to align with what actually occurred? The answer matters less than the effect. The prophecy's fulfillment, accurate to within months, created a narrative where Rasputin became a figure of fate and destiny, rather than merely a controversial courtier. He became someone who had seen the future, who had warned of catastrophe, who had been proven right by events. This transformed him from problematic historical figure into something approaching mythological status. In the end, Grigori Rasputin remains irreducible to simple categories. He was peasant and courtier, holy man and sinner, healer and corrupter, prophet and fraud, or perhaps all of these simultaneously. He rose from absolute obscurity to influence the fate of empires, then fell to murder that became legend. His story encompasses themes of faith and reason, of power and manipulation, of the collision between traditional societies and modern forces they cannot comprehend. The legend refuses to die because the questions it raises remain relevant. How do charlatans gain power over the educated and sophisticated? How does superstition survive in scientific ages? How do desperate people become vulnerable to manipulation? How do individuals, however unlikely, come to influence historical events far beyond their apparent capacity? These questions do not have simple answers, and Rasputin's story illuminates them without resolving them. Nearly a century after his death, Rasputin remains what he became in life, a mirror in which observers see reflected their own preoccupations and fears. To some, he represents the danger of religious extremism and rejection of rational thought. To others, he embodies the mysterious and inexplicable aspects of human existence that materialism cannot address. To still others, he is simply a fascinating scoundrel whose unlikely career makes for compelling story. The mad monk from Siberia, who walked barefoot across continents and whispered in the ears of emperors, who healed a child when doctors failed and contributed to an empire's collapse, who could not be killed by poison or bullets, and who drowned beneath ice while still breathing. This figure lives on in imagination and debate, refusing the obscurity that claims most historical figures, his legend as unkillable as the man himself was rumoured to be. Perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps a figure who in life defied conventional categories deserves to remain in death a subject of endless controversy and fascination. Grigori Rasputin, dead more than a century, continues to grip the imagination, his dark influence extending far beyond his actual life into the realm of legend and myth, where simple truth becomes impossible, and where his story will be told and retold as long as people remain fascinated by the intersection of power, faith, corruption, and the strange forces that move through history in ways that rational minds can observe but never fully comprehend.